The whole city was empty and covered in cobwebs. Many buildings and factories stood idle. There was not a soul around. Cars that had once been used by people stood abandoned, some of them open. Police cars were dented and resembled a pile of scrap metal. The city was absolutely empty. From a bird's eye view, it looked eerie because nothing reminded of life. The protagonist stood there wondering why this had happened, his face covered in blood and his expression conveying horror. He remembered the old days, the girl with the ring, about how she confidently walked in her pink shoes next to an expensive car parked at the curb. He remembered her blissful face with makeup and dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. He couldn't believe that all this had disappeared in an instant. The hero wondered why he couldn't prevent what happened, remembering the fight with this girl. They struggled, clinging to each other and falling down. Once he was close to punching her, but she stopped him. Then she got ahead of him and slapped him herself. He stood topless, arms outstretched, recalling these events, screaming with bitterness. His narrowed eyes and his whole face conveyed despair. He wondered only one question, remembering the way she grabbed his hand, why everything was like this now. Many images from the past came to his mind, like a girl in pink shoes falling onto the asphalt from a powerful collision. He also remembered another girl with glasses and a machine gun, capable of causing harm, a girl with purple hair who clung to a ledge to keep from falling into the abyss. And the way he ran across the highway, dodging the bullets of that girl with the machine gun. He remembered the collisions between the cars and couldn't understand why it all happened. Images of a crying woman screaming in front of an oncoming car came flooding into his mind. And he, looking at this, screamed from the understanding of her inevitable death. 3 years after the Sendu disaster, the city had fallen into disrepair. Many places were overgrown with moss and grass, and only the croaking of birds could be heard amidst the devastation and deserted places. Fashion brand clothing stores were also covered with huge awnings made of cobwebs, among similarly abandoned buildings. There were only animals walking on the streets, foxes were lying on the hoods of cars, and there was trash lying around. The metro stations were also no longer working. They were flooded with water, and from the entrance one could see escalators going down into the swamp. But in the very center of the city, in the middle of a wide roadway, there was an island of life. There was a bed in it, and things were scattered around. Suddenly, the alarm clock on the bedside table rang, indicating 6 in the morning. The human hand immediately reached for the button to turn it off. This was the main character, the only one left in this city. He opened his eyes in disappointment, still asleep. Then, with a sharp movement, he jumped onto the bed. He was completely naked, lying on a bed in the middle of an abandoned city. It was there that he began his morning workout, boxing and doing push-ups, leaning against the headboard of the bed. After doing his abdominal exercises, he finished his workout. He then walked over to the nearest trash can next to the bed to use it as a toilet. He did this in the midst of the skyscrapers of large corporations, being in the center of the road, not embarrassed by anyone, and being absolutely confident and free. He then ran towards the shopping center opposite. The sign at the entrance has already faded and deteriorated over time. He went inside and took drinks from the refrigerator. Then he went to another shelf and took a pack of powdered milk. The guy immediately opened it with a bang, and he began to pour the contents of the bag into his mouth, after which he immediately began to cough, exhaling clouds of powder. Then he walked towards the exit of the store. The hero entered the entrance and began to climb the stairs, simultaneously consuming what he had bought from the supermarket. When he reached the roof, he creaked open the door to it and, finishing his food, checked the situation. There were huge solar panels on the roof, and he walked past them and headed to his daily routine. There were cages with hens and roosters nearby. He approached them and greeted them. Then he put his hand into a nearby bag of food and scooped up a handful. Through the cage, he began to feed all the chickens there with this grain. Below them was a compartment containing the eggs he received from them. Reaching for one, he picked it up and broke the shell by hitting it against the chicken cage. He poured the raw egg into his mouth. Then the hero moved on to the tables with seedlings and greens. He saw that the strawberries in the pots were already ripe and picked several of them, hanging in bunches. Then he put it in his mouth, standing among the tall glass buildings and looking down on the city. Having finished chewing the last berry, he walked over to the record player standing nearby. There was a remote control lying on it. He took it in his hands. Then, pressing the button to start recording through the built-in microphone, he said that it was the 1094th day after the Chin disaster, and there were still no people. He then walked over to the satellite dish where he was drying the fish and picked one up. After that, he moved on to watering the plants nearby. His routine included watering a huge area, for which he brought a fire truck and used a hose to put out fires, spraying water several meters ahead. Parked nearby was a truck with a huge metal fuel tank from which he was draining gasoline. The hero poured it into canisters and approached the special generators into which he poured it. After that, he decided to play football on the nearby field. He rushed forward, kicking the ball and pushing away the opponents around him. His opponents were dummies dressed in the uniform of the Spanish team Barcelona, which he placed around the field. After most of them were already lying on the field, he approached his main goal. Once at the goal, he kicked the ball with great force. The hero hit the target, scoring the decisive goal. He was happy, as if he was playing with real opponents. He then ran down the pitch and performed his signature goal celebration. He skidded across the lawn on his knees and with his arms outstretched, and stopped. In front of him stood a girl mannequin dressed in a cheerleader uniform. He continued to yell and celebrate his victory under the hanging red ribbon and the mannequin next to him. This is how his new day began. Then it was morning again. The alarm clock showed that it was already 8 o'clock. He woke up tired, as if he hadn't slept that night. This time he was sitting on a black leather sofa, in the middle of the street, with the same mannequin girl from the field sitting next to him, and piles of beer cans scattered around. In front of him was a table with a stack of books on it, containing both gardening guides and self-help books. There was a gaming console lying nearby, and discs with popular games scattered around. In addition to other trash, books and discs, there were also erotic covers with girls among them. All this was interspersed with empty tin cans of food and other provisions from containers with supplies for the military. The hero sat in the middle of this junk and tried to come to his senses after last night. The sun was already approaching its zenith. There was not a soul around, the wide tracks were empty, and the digital advertising boards were not working. He sat there like that until 10 in the morning. Then he decided to read one of the books, but by 11 o'clock he was already asleep, covering his face with a book and lying on the lap of a mannequin. An hour later, he again decided to take the food out of the container and eat. A couple of hours later, he was fast asleep, face down, lying on his stomach, still completely naked. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sunset had come. The sun was disappearing behind the roofs of the buildings. The hero was still lying on the sofa, changing only his position. By 8 o'clock in the evening, he was sitting as if exactly the same as when he woke up, with the only difference being that it was dark all around. He sat and thought about his life, immersed in existential reflections. Then he decided that he really needed to get up and do something. He straightened up, stretched, and yawned. The stars had already appeared in the sky. After scratching himself, he walked in the opposite direction towards the nearest buildings. The hero approached the car, covered with a thick awning, and grabbed it, intending to take it off. Having torn off the velvet burgundy canopy, he saw a new expensive car in front of him. It was a silver Lamborghini convertible with a leather interior. He got in and started the car, then began to drive out of the parking lot, which contained many other expensive cars. The car made loud noises, and its wheels spun so fast that it seemed as if they had stopped. Turning on his high beams, he drove along the highway. The hero left the city, passing bridges and roads, without a single lantern. He liked the speed, and was happy to drive such a car. He pressed the gas harder and harder. In front of him was only an empty straight road, illuminated only by the light of his headlights. Taking the steering wheel with both hands, he drove and felt like a king, laughing and talking to himself like a madman. Suddenly, he started honking the horn, pressing on the center of the steering wheel. He continued to press the button countless times. He pounded the steering wheel like a madman until the signal became a single stream of sound. Then he took his hand off the steering wheel. With angry cries, he began to let go of the other hand. He kept pressing on the gas, accelerating faster and faster. At some point, the speedometer on the dashboard had already passed the 130 kilometers per hour mark. When the arrow already showed about 220 kilometers, an idea came to him. In a frenzy, he stared ahead through the windshield, still laughing. Then he reached for the seatbelt, the strap of which hung over his shoulder and secured his body. He unfastened the fastening, and the belt jumped out of the latch. In his madness, he continued to scream, starting to rise from his seat in the car, flying at great speed. As he stood up, he held only the steering wheel and screamed at the top of his lungs. He was in high spirits and screamed like a ferocious animal, wrinkling his face. At that moment, whether it was the wind or not, tears began to gather in his eyes. With the strong flow of the headwind, tears rolled back down his face as he screamed, wondering where all the people were. The guy glanced down at the steering wheel with the car logo on it that he was holding onto, and then he let him go. He could not straighten up completely because the headwind was rushing at great speed and throwing his body back. Then he spread his arms and flew like a bird soaring in the sky. He was leaning only on his right foot, which was on the gas pedal, and after he stood up, the speed began to increase sharply. The needle on the speedometer reached 280 kilometers per hour, and the car began to make a loud roar. He closed his eyes and continued to stand on the pedal with his arms outstretched to the sides, his face and lips beginning to sway in the strong wind. Before him was only a dark road without a single soul or light. At that speed, the whole car vibrated from every bump on the road. The steering wheel began to shake. Perhaps no one had ever accelerated to that speed before. The indicator was already at 340 kilometers per hour. The car hummed along with the hero, who opened his mouth. He tried to grit his teeth, but the wind made it difficult to do even that. The landscape ahead did not change. The road had already turned into a static picture. Finally, he clenched his teeth with a grinding sound, holding back all his despair. Then sounds began to come from ahead. It seemed impossible in such a remote place. The sound was getting closer, and realizing this, the guy opened his eyes wide from the fear that washed over him. In the distance, the silhouette of a man appeared in front of him, illuminated by his headlights and standing in the middle of the night road. He tried in horror to grab the steering wheel and prevent a collision. Grabbing it, he began to steer to the side. At high speed, his car crashed headlight first into the guardrail, shattering into pieces. He pressed the brake with all his might, but the car moved forward. After the collision, by inertia, he flew face first into the windshield. The car, with its brakes applied, flew further along the barrier, producing sparks from the friction of the surfaces. Blood appeared on the bridge of his nose as he tried to control the car and steer it. Eventually, he started to get the hang of it, and the car began to slow down. The car bounced off the fence as it braked, and, flying to the side, she stopped, illuminating the field and greenery next to the road with her headlights. With a bloody nose and horror on his face, he looked ahead, still holding the steering wheel. He exhaled and stood up from his seat to look in the direction where the silhouette was. Due to the stress he had experienced, he was all wet. The guy stood up and did not understand whether this was reality or his hallucinations. In front of him was the same dark and unlit road, and there was no one on it. He looked at her, his mouth slightly open, still recovering from the shock. He then bent down and reached into the glove compartment of the car to get a flashlight. Grabbing it, he jumped out of the dented and scratched convertible. He looked ahead, trying to make out anything. Then, with trembling hands, he felt for the power button on the flashlight. He turned it on and pointed it in front of him into the distance. There was still nothing and no one visible on the road except the black stripes left by his drift. He began to squint and peer, moving slowly forward. He walked barefoot step by step, stepping on the stones from the crumbling asphalt. The boy still couldn't see anything in front of him, but suddenly he heard the sound ahead again. He was shocked by this, because it meant that he had not really imagined it. Then, looking closely and walking a few meters, he began to notice outlines. As he approached, he again saw that silhouette on the road, standing in the same place. The hero came closer and began to understand that it was a girl. He was struck by the fact that he was not the only person who survived. She stood there in torn clothes and one shoe. Behind her was a small cart on wheels, and in her hands she was holding a small goat. Her eyes were filled with tears. Her appearance was pitiful and frightened. They rolled down her cheeks. The girl could not utter a word. Her face was all covered in abrasions and dirt. She began to sob, her mouth open. The stranger could not believe what she saw. Having released the animal, she ran as fast as she could towards the man, screaming at the top of her lungs. He realized she was flying at him and cowered, his face still expressing horror. Then he remembered that he was naked and covered himself, moving the flashlight to the side. The girl jumped on him at once. The guy only managed to move back a little. Still sobbing, she hugged him. He froze with the girl hanging on him, still trying to comprehend what was happening. From such a raid, he dropped the lantern, the girl hung on it like a monkey, and continued to cry. Then in response he hugged her too, placing his hand on her back. They stood together in the middle of the road among the fields, completely alone and in complete darkness. Once in the city, they settled down next to the sofa. The guy asked where she was from and was very surprised to learn that she had walked from Lhasa. On the table opposite, the girl laid out the products she was carrying with her in a cart. She took a peach compote in a 3-liter jar and said that she sometimes rode a bicycle along part of the route. Then she picked up the can and took a sip of the drink. Suddenly, the hero realized that the sounds he heard on the road came from the bleating of a goat. The girl said that it was inconvenient for her to ride a bike with the goat, so she had to walk. The hero frowned questioningly, looking at this picture. Having put on at least some clothes, he asked her if the girl had really been walking like this for 6 months. She replied that, in fact, she had walked for 9 months, although she thought that she would be able to reach Shanghai in 6 months, but she only managed to get to this place, and she began her journey as soon as she heard about what happened on the radio. The guy noticed and said that she was very strong. She asked if satellite signals were the only ones reaching his location, but he replied that there were others. The girl asked if he had checked the radio broadcast. At this point, the hero was trying to set up his laptop while sitting on the asphalt and said that he didn't know that the radio was still working, since he hadn't used it for a long time. She said that she heard the news on the radio last year. Without turning around, he sarcastically praised her, continuing to do his job, taking the pliers in his hands. He asked her if she went to Tibet with her family. By that time, he had already managed to turn on the laptop and connect everything he needed. He added that he thought that all the people went there. Then he sat down at the laptop and, staring at the screen, asked the girl if there really was no one else there, except her. Then, hearing no answer, he raised his head to her in surprise. She hung her head down, trembling, and tried to open the bag of chips. Then she brought her hand to her face and wiped it. Looking at all this, he felt a deep sadness. Tears from her eyes dripped onto her hands and clothes, but she made no sound. He reached for the pack to snatch it from the girl's hands. The guy opened the snack package with ease. Then he handed it back, looking at her with a band-aid stuck to her nose. She covered her face with her hand, and hiding behind her hair, didn't even see that he handed her the chips. Suddenly she raised her head and exclaimed, in tears, that the people who had gone to treat the others had already died themselves. She began to list the names of her acquaintances, among whom were Larry, Natsu, Wudao Liang. The girl said that all of them were already dead. Sobbing, she said that tens of thousands of bodies lay on each floor. He calmly noted that there were most likely even more people. She replied that the deadly Highland virus was a fiction. The girl added that the deaths were not related to illness and did not look like the action of viruses. All people died from cold and hunger. The guy meanwhile sat down at the laptop again and turned his back to her. Without looking up from his work, he asked how she herself had survived under such circumstances. The girl replied that she had not been infected, so her mother, thinking that her daughter was immune to it, left her in Lhasa to wait for their return. She waited for her family for 2 whole years, but her family never returned, still crying, the girl said. The guy continued to sit silently at the laptop. The goat jumped off the back of the sofa and approached its owner. Making characteristic sounds, she silently hugged it and leaned towards the animal's head. They sat in silence in the middle of the dark road and mountains of abandoned garbage from dirty cans and preserves. The guy kept trying to do something on the laptop, fiddling with different programs. Suddenly, he pressed the last key, announcing that everything was ready. With joy on his face, he stood up, holding his laptop in his hands and looking ahead, then announced that they now had a cinema. The girl looked in amazement at the opposite side of the street in front of her. Her face began to be illuminated by the light coming from there. The banner's digital screen, which hadn't been used in a long time, began to show static and a buzzing white noise sound. Then a picture suddenly appeared, but it turned out that the guy had turned on something indecent. He blushed with shame because he himself did not expect that this would turn on. He then immediately tried to fix it by quickly tapping the keys on his laptop. At that moment, the satellite dish made a sound. Colored interference and stripes appeared on the banner screen. Then, through the static, the face of a woman from the board appeared, sitting at a table in the official office, addressing the citizens. When the interference cleared, it became clear that it was the acting U.S. president, sitting against a backdrop of flags. She introduced herself as Hillary Clinton. In English, she said she wanted to reach out to all the world's inhabitants via radio and satellite broadcasts. The girl screamed in amazement that this was exactly what she had told him about. He was surprised and continued to stare at the screen silently. Hillary Clinton began to talk about how they had gone through very difficult times over the past 2 years. The girl whispered, "Has it really been 2 years already?" To which the guy asked her with his hand not to interfere with listening. The screen told us that they had lost friends and family and were fighting with all their might for their hopes. However, Hillary said she believed that those listening to her had not lost faith in the rebirth of humanity. She said it was only faith and hard work over the past 2 years that brought nearly 1 million Americans together. Sitting on the sofa and looking at the huge banner, they continued to listen to how the authorities had taken control of the disaster and were on the way to rebuilding society. Clinton joyfully exclaimed on behalf of all Americans that the United States had restored culture and humanity. The guy was amazed by what he heard and even opened his mouth. The woman continued to talk about how, by that time after the disaster, there had even been a Taylor Swift concert, which she attended. The screen showed a huge stage with light lasers and a crowd of people, and it was stated that more than 8,000 people attended the real live concert. The guy cursed, not believing his eyes as he looked at the image. The girl was delighted. Her eyes sparkled at the sight of this. Clinton added that despite all this, the United States has not forgotten about the rest of the people scattered around the world. She said they had set up special outposts around the world to restore culture in other countries as well. Hillary said that with the help of 10 satellites, they covered the entire planet with communications and provided internet connection. The guy kept swearing, his mouth open in surprise. The woman then added that the location of the points would be broadcast on this channel for 24 hours and that everyone who could hear her needed to go there. The girl saw the name of the nearest point to them and exclaimed, pointing her finger at the running line on the screen, they needed to move to the sea in Baiting. Clinton kept saying that no one should worry and that aid from states does not depend on their affiliation. They should be sent to these points anyway. Beside himself, the guy could no longer stop swearing and only repeated the curses, wrinkling his nose. He was glad that there were people in the world and that life around him had not stopped. He was shocked and ran up to the girl to say that in so many years he had never heard or seen a single living person. He jumped up in joy, throwing his laptop aside. The guy jumped around like crazy in front of an unfamiliar girl, unable to contain his emotions. In response, she also smiled and was happy with such news as a child. She jumped up with him, holding 2 pillows from the sofa above her and screaming with joy. They started to fool around. He broke the mannequin that was sitting on the couch, knocked over everything that was lying on their table, and the girl started a pillow fight. Then Hillary Clinton, addressing the sisters, said that God had protected humanity and the United States would support all those in need. Covered in feathers flying around, the boy turned to the screen in bewilderment. He stopped and looked at him carefully, thinking about what he had heard. He didn't understand why the appeal was addressed to the sisters, but ultimately decided not to attach much importance to it. After a while, they went to bed. The girl, having covered herself, lay down on the sofa, and the guy sprawled out on the mattress lying a little further away from him. He lay down in the star pose and looked at the starry sky. The girl asked him if he wanted to go to baiting. He answered positively. She said that there were people in Shanghai too, and maybe they should go there, but he said that he wanted to go to baiting. Then the two started arguing about which city was closer. The guy asked her if she wanted to go to baiting with him. She agreed, and on that note, he turned to his side, saying that he was going to bed, and that tomorrow he would teach her how to drive. She also went to bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. The next morning, they got a few pairs of new sneakers from the store for the trip. Then they gathered, stocking up on provisions and everything necessary for the trip, and dragged boxes of things and food into the trunk of the car. The guy took the cages with the chickens and put them with him too. On the way, they got out of the car and released the birds. They stopped right on the side of the road and released them into the forest. The hero knew each chicken by name and said goodbye to them by shouting after them. Then they got into the car and slammed the doors. He started the car, turning the key, and the characteristic sound of ignition was emitted. In the navigator, he indicated the destination Bayton and plotted a route. The girl leaned out of the panoramic sunroof of the car and began waving into the wind, marking the beginning of their journey. For the trip, they chose a spacious Geländewagen car to fit everything they needed and ride comfortably. The girl spread her arms and stood with her head thrown back in the open hatch. They passed through deserted fields where only human remains were found, thousands of bones and skulls. At a certain point on the road, passing abandoned cars, they saw ahead a huge plane broken in half, blocking the road. The guy asked the girl to slow down and drive more slowly. She sat behind the wheel and looked up in admiration at the giant plane, completely oblivious to the road. The guy took the wheel to help her avoid crashing. They then slipped through the gap under the plane and survived, continuing on their way. The hero, sighing from stress, still controlled the steering wheel from the passenger seat and asked the girl to look at the road while she looked at the surrounding landscape. She asked his name, but he, ignoring her question, continued to ask her to slow down. In response, the girl smiled and asked if his name was Slowdown, adding that that was what she would call him from now on. They pulled onto another freeway, still arguing about speed. Driving past the fields, the girl suddenly braked. She saw watermelons through the window and screamed about it. She braked so abruptly that the guy again flew face first into the windshield and dashboard. While he held his nose, she, paying no attention to him, opened the door and went outside. As she approached the field, she turned around and shouted at him to look at the watermelons. He continued to groan in pain and held his face with his hand. The girl and her goat were frolicking in the field, noticing that in addition to watermelons, grapes were also growing there. Holding his nose with his hand, the guy began to move into the driver's seat. Sitting down on it, he reached behind the seat to grab a plastic container. He threw it to the girl through the open window and asked her to take more. And he himself closed the door and said that he would arrive soon. Then he set off and moved forward along the road that crossed the field. The girl turned around in bewilderment. When she realized he was leaving, she raised her hand and started waving at him. She ran after the car with her pet and shouted to him. He reached for a napkin and pressed it to his bloody nose to wipe it away. Then he looked in the side mirror. He saw a girl in the distance running across the field after his car. Her face was all red and scared. He braked sharply. Then, turning to her, he lowered the window and looked questioningly. She rushed towards him and asked where he was going. The guy told her that he wanted to collect some things and would come back for her later. When the girl had already run up to the car, she immediately began to tug on the door handle and say that she wanted to go with him. He answered her calmly, asking her to stay and pick some grapes. In horror, she hung on the door handle and said that she did not want to stay there and would definitely go with him. He took out a second container and said that they should split the tasks, otherwise they would not make it to baiting by the next day. She cried out in despair that she didn't even eat grapes. He looked at her silently, bewildered. Then he smiled and said that he was eating grapes. Then he thrust a blue container into her hands and told her to go collect it and that he would arrive soon. She looked at him in horror, begging him to take her with him and not leave her there. He smiled and said he wouldn't leave her. Then he raised his hand to her frightened face and added that he would never do that. The guy continued speaking, looking her straight in the eyes. He said seriously that he now considers her his own. Her eyes widened and conveyed surprise and fear. Meanwhile, the goat ran up to the car. She began to bleat and butt against her wheel. After which, he drove away, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and a girl with a container in her hands, looking after him. He arrived at the nearest town and stopped at a building with a sign. Then he opened the car door and stepped out, looking ahead. With a wrench, he headed towards the front door of the building. After a while, the girl had already collected containers with watermelons and grapes and, in her new pink sneakers, stood on a small concrete sign on the road. She looked out to see if there was a car ahead. She stood on her toes and looked into the distance, covering her eyes from above, as if using a visor from the sun. By that time, a car appeared on the horizon. She smiled happily, her eyes shining radiantly. Then she jumped off the sign and was about to run towards him. But suddenly I remembered the specially broken piece of watermelon and decided to take it. She ran to the car window, handing the watermelon to the guy, and noted that the grapes were too sour, so they should only take watermelons. He opened the car door and took the piece from her. The girl noticed a new thing attached to the roof of the car and asked about its purpose. He replied that it was a very useful thing for them. He reached through the window into the box on the back seat and pulled out a new iPhone. The guy handed it to the girl. She immediately asked if it worked, and if there was internet on it, the guy suggested she try it. She was very happy and jumped for joy. He got behind the wheel, and the girl got into the passenger seat and immediately began to figure out the phone. She told him that she could not connect and could not open any of the local messengers. He advised her to try Western Twitter and Facebook, and she asked if they needed a VPN. He didn't answer this question and only smiled. Then she screamed that everything was finally working for her and even jumped up and down with joy. She handed the phone to the driver to show that there were Chinese there, and quite a lot of them. Staring at her phone, she explained that they were in Beijing, Shanghai, Yamen, and Fuhang. His eyes also showed delight at such news. They began to rejoice at this together, not believing their happiness. In this mood, they went to Beijing. They passed another sign indicating that the turn they needed would be in just 1 kilometer. The guy thought for a moment and said that something was wrong with this situation. He said that the two of them had not seen a single living person for 3 years, and he asked why they all suddenly appeared. The girl stared at her phone and told him that they were most likely all in the east because the soil there was nutritious and there was plenty of food. He said that it seemed very strange to him. She replied that it was not this that was strange, but something else. Looking at his phone, he asked her what she meant. She reported that there was a discussion on Reddit about men, and they said they were all dead, handing him the phone screen. The guy turned and looked at her with confusion. She showed discussions with themes about how, if there are no men left on Earth, should all girls become lesbians. Some were surprised by this, some blamed feminists, smirking whether they were now happy with this arrangement, but they all gained thousands of likes and comments. These topics worried everyone. To this, the guy responded to her to check US Twitter. She quickly went in to read what was written there and brought the phone to his eyes. The news stated that in all 26 strongholds, there was not a single man, and everyone regretted this loss. He looked at it for a long time and intently, puzzled by the information. Then he burst out laughing, opening his mouth wide. He turned sharply to the girl and mockingly asked if there really wasn't a single man left. Then he laughed loudly again. She did not understand such a reaction and looked at him with displeasure. He asked her to drive because he wanted to read the news for now, but she refused. He reached out for the phone and asked her to hand it over quickly, but she dodged it, not wanting to do it. The guy frowned and told her in a serious tone that he was the last man on the planet and ordered her to give him the phone quickly. He continued to laugh. She sent him to hell. While they were arguing, the car swerved from side to side on the road. After some time, they passed another sign indicating that there were only 30 kilometers left to the desired point. Having stopped in another town on the way, they saw a hotel there, and the guy flew into it right in his car up the stairs. They drove into the main elegant hall with columns, breaking the glass of the entrance doors and panoramic windows. The two of them got out of the car, and the girl asked if it would be possible to get to Baton today. Opening the trunk, he said no, and that they should take a hot bath first. Digging through the boxes he had collected, he listed what was needed to get a good night's sleep. And tomorrow, beautiful and fresh, they will go to Baton. She smiled happily. The guy got hold of special generators that he had filled up back in his deserted city. He connected it to the water heaters and hung them in the water. The girl lay down in front of the bathtub built into the floor, in which the water was heated, and said that she was not feeling any fun. He noticed that the water was already hot, but she said that it was not. Continuing to lie motionless, her hand dropped into the water. He stood up and said that he would go look for clothes for her. She expressed a desire to wear a dress. Without turning around, he gestured to her that he understood her and left the room. She became inspired and decided that she could get into the water right now. She abruptly lifted her t-shirt, exposing her body. At that moment, the guy just looked out from behind the entrance curtains to tell her that in case she decided to do this, she needed to first turn off the generators and then climb into the water. She immediately dropped her shirt and screamed at him with all her might. Closing his eyes, he awkwardly apologized and disappeared behind the curtains again. She frowned her displeased face and blushed with shame. There was a large shopping center nearby, so the guy headed there. He swept everything he saw on the shelves into the basket. It was expensive women's cosmetics and face and body care products. Then he moved on to the shelf with perfumes and also collected literally everything that was there into the basket. After which, he went into the men's department and modestly took some shower gel. Apart from him and the razor, he didn't need anything else. As he walked towards the exit, he saw a clothing store and shone his flashlight into it. He saw that inside there were female mannequins and dresses and neat stacks of other clothes. He decided that he needed to get it for the girl. It was just what he needed. By that time, the girl had already gotten out of the bath and was drying herself with a towel. She saw that there was a neatly folded flowered dress and new shoes lying nearby. She was delighted and quickly rushed to try it on. A roar approaching at high speed could be heard through the corridors of the hotel. It came from the sound of new women's high-heeled boots. The girl ran with her eyes wide open and painted. She ran to the guy's room to quickly show him how her new dress looked on her. She ran to his door and burst into the room. The girl stood up like a doll, admiringly showing off her entire outfit and hairstyle. Suddenly she saw in front of her a guy with neatly styled hair and in an elegant suit with a tie and shirt. His whole image shone with gloss and audacity. She was surprised and expected something a little different. The guy continued to look at her and smile with a Don Juan look. For a few seconds everyone froze and an awkward pause hung in the room. The girl frowned, not hearing the compliments, realizing that he looked so good that he seemed to overshadow her appearance with his. After that, she snorted in displeasure and turned to leave. The guy asked in a friendly manner what happened, while the girl frowned and left the room. He suggested that perhaps she didn't like the dress, but she, without turning to look at him, replied that he looked prettier than her, and he tried to convince her otherwise. She turned to him and told him not to worry about it as she walked away down the corridor. Approaching the right door, she said that he was already the only man left. Opening the door to her room, she added that even if he were a bald freak, girls would still fall for him. He was flattered by her comments, but awkwardly disagreed with her, smiling and rubbing his neck. Before she could finish speaking, she went inside and the door of her room slammed right in front of his nose. He was surprised and continued to stare ahead with wide eyes. On the door in front of him was the number 307. After standing in the corridor for a short time, he decided to return. He made a face and rubbed his head, then clicked his tongue. The guy was surprised that Shanghainese people are very daring. After a while, they continued their route, passing more signs and markers about the nearest gas stations, cafes, and settlements. On one of them, the girl sitting behind the wheel noticed a sign that they were approaching the 6th ring and pointed at it with her finger. The guy was sitting with the goat, his feet in patent leather shoes thrown onto the glove compartment, and she told him that they had finally arrived in Beijing. He leaned back leisurely and asked her what they would do first in the city. Without taking her eyes off the road, she, without thinking twice, announced that she wanted to try the Beitin duck. Then she said she wanted to go to the Forbidden Town to spend the whole night there. He said that there would be no problem with that. Turning to the guy, she said that she knew what he wanted. He asked her what she meant. She turned to him and with her mouth wide open in a grin, shouted that he wanted to have sex. He laughed, and she continued to laugh, and added that he wanted to sleep with all the women in Beijing. The guy was tipsy about this suggestion and continued to laugh, telling her that it was all her imagination. He added sarcastically that he could not dare and of course would not do such a thing. Then he continued to burst into laughter, tossing and turning in his seat. She was already starting to dislike it and ordered him to stop clucking. Suddenly she saw people on the road and was shocked, turning to him. In the field they passed there were vans and people engaged in farming. He saw this and his mouth dropped open in surprise. He hadn't seen such a crowd of people for a very long time. The girl began waving at them, looking out of the car window, after which his eyes no longer sparkled with admiration. As he approached, he began to notice a strange scene taking place among those present. He frowned, realizing that something was wrong here. Between the two girls, there was a third one, kneeling in front of them with her hands tied. The girl behind the wheel asked what they were doing, but the guy sitting closer to the window told her to go straight ahead. Those standing in the field turned to look at those passing by. Then he saw one of them put a knife to the kneeling girl and lash out, cutting her throat. His eyes filled with horror. After what he saw, he pressed himself into the seat and could not tear his eyes away from what he saw. Blood gushed between the standing girls. Looking at this from the window in bewilderment, he ordered the girl behind the wheel to step on the gas quickly from there. She climbed up and tried to see what was going on there. He held her face back and asked her not to stop. The car, slowing down at the side of the road, rushed off into the distance with dust. A long-legged girl looked after them, holding a knife in her hand with blood dripping down it. When they had passed, he turned around again to see if they were following. He turned to the girl Xiao behind the wheel, and she responded. Continuing to sit there with an unperturbed expression and digest what had happened, he told her that perhaps Beijing would not be like this. And as they approached the city sign that loomed in the distance, he added that the city was not what they thought. After which, a terrible picture appeared before them. The bodies of dead girls were hung on a signboard located on the bridge. After a while, they passed by a traditional Chinese temple located by the highway. The guy glanced at it, while the navigator indicated that in 200 meters they would already be there. The girl asked him with a shocked expression where they were going. He told her to turn left. They went to Nianmen Square. Suddenly he saw an obstacle ahead and cursed. Ahead, several girls set up a checkpoint, putting up barriers and standing guard. They gestured to the approaching vehicles to stop. The boy tried to ruffle his hair to hide behind it. Xiao naively told them that they were going to Nianmen Square. There were two girls at the post in the back of a pickup truck. One of them had a machine gun and was wearing sunglasses. She boldly told them that entry was prohibited, to which Xiao clarified the reason. She disinterestedly blew a pink bubble gum and told them to get lost. The guy quietly asked Xiao to go, but she, disobeying him, continued the dialogue with them, explaining that they were going to a US stronghold. She continued to say that they were going to take part in the reconstruction, to which she heard a rude order to leave, which was what the guy asked for. She was surprised. Suddenly, the girl with the gun pulled down her glasses and squinted, directing her gaze at the passenger seat. The guy sat, fidgeting and covering himself with his hair in hand. She immediately jumped off the back of the truck, spitting out her gum and headed toward the car. Approaching them with a machine gun, she demanded that they get out of it without further ado. They were shocked and sat looking at her in horror. She pointed the gun at them and ordered them to carry out her request faster. The guy turned pale, his mouth slightly open. He quietly lowered his hand down and grabbed the wrench. The girl headed towards the window on his side. At that moment, the screams of the third girl were heard. She was shouting at the one with the weapon, addressing her as a sister. It was a friendly girl with purple hair. She was running, approaching the car and talking about how they were our own. She ran up, reached out her hand to the goat hanging out of the window in the back seat, and began to pet it. Then she confidently said that she was new behind the wheel and didn't yet know anything about the rules of modern life, pointing to the car. The girl with the gun had already taken aim, placing the handle of the machine gun on her shoulder and pointing it at the guy. Looking at those sitting in the car, she asked if the person in the passenger seat was a trans. In response to this, the purple-haired girl, expressing complete awareness, laughed and said ironically that at the moment, no. She replied that it was a girl from the physical education department, hinting that they had studied together. She then brought her hand to the guy's chin and neck and drew his attention threateningly to what a strong and sturdy girl she was. Then she said sarcastically that she was a little baby at heart. With these words, she extended her hand to the chest of the girl with the machine gun and tried to squeeze it mockingly. She suddenly leaned back from her and ordered her to be more careful and take her hands away from her. The purple-haired girl then waved in a friendly manner to those in the car and said that they could go. Then she opened the car door and was about to get into it. Before that, she stopped and handed 2 chocolates to the girl who was carrying a gun and added that they would see each other again. She accepted the gift and, waving her hand, said that they could go. Then everyone got into the car. The girl with purple hair waved to the rest. The passage was opened for them, and they drove on. The fellow traveler sat down in the car in a leisurely manner in the back seat, throwing her legs onto the driver's seat. She said that she saved their lives. Xiao thanked her in return while the guy drove the car. He asked her who she was. The girl introduced herself as the Dongbei Army. She said that the base of those girls at the post is located beyond the second circle, and ordinary people are not allowed to enter there. The girl hugged the goat and emphasized that this ban especially applies to trans people like him. Addressing the driver, such people should not even go near it. To which Xiao immediately responded by saying that her friend was not trans. The guy immediately tried to interrupt her and asked his fellow traveler how to get to the American outpost. After this scene, Army suspected something and looked closely at both the girl and the guy without saying a word. Then she turned to him and slyly said that the checkpoint had moved. They had been kicked out of the second ring. He asked her about the new location. In response, she asked him to give her their animal, to which Xiao immediately hysterically refused. But the army didn't stop. She reached into her pocket and took out something, saying that she would give them this thing in exchange for the animal. The guy glanced at her through the windshield mirror without any interest and with distrust and said nothing. She took a pistol out of her pocket. A ray of sunlight from the window fell on it, and it was clear that it was a combat weapon. She held it up to the driver's face with 2 fingers and said that this was the only thing that was valuable in the modern world. The guy told her to ask Xiao about this issue. She shouted again that she was against this idea, to which the girl began to slowly raise the barrel of the gun and put it to the driver's head. Xiao's eyes widened in surprise, and she silently looked at this scene. When she put the gun right to his head, he, without hesitation or worry, did not pay any attention to it and repeated that it was not for him to decide. Then the army laughed and leaned back on the back seat again, saying that it was all a joke and that she would show them the way to the point. In her usual manner, she threw her feet up on the driver's seat and told him to go straight ahead and then turn left, then go up Madun. Meanwhile, their car was already driving past various buildings, being within the city limits. The army pointed its finger at a certain place and said that it would get off there, but that it could not go further because foreigners did not like it. The car pulled over to the side of the road to stop and let its passenger out. She opened the door and said goodbye, saying that if they needed anything, they should find her, because in baiting she could get anything. As she was getting out of the car, she grabbed the animal with her and was about to get out when the guy grabbed her hand. She turned to him and looked at him with an innocent look, as if nothing was happening. He was serious and looked at her with a displeased face, continuing to hold her wrist. At that moment, the goat began to bleat. The army stopped smiling, but continued to look silently at the driver. She had a gun in her hand, so she felt in a position of power. However, the guy didn't pay any attention to this and continued to drill her with his displeased gaze. Then she laughed as if it was all just another joke, let go of the animal and released it, raising her hands up. She got out of their car and slammed the door behind her. The boy thanked her emotionlessly, addressing her through the open window on Xiao's side. She leaned over with interest, looking at him, and said that it was not worth thanking. Then, with a coquettish wink, she said that he really did look like a guy. After which their car drove away, the army remained in the same place and looked ahead after those driving away. She was definitely interested in these two. She began to suspect that it really was a guy, and perhaps she was not imagining things. They pulled up to a tall glass skyscraper with banners hanging on it. There were several more such buildings around with signs of clothing brands. The guy drove up to the entrance of the point, which was on the first floor. At a special stand sat a girl with a ponytail on one side and wearing a purple t-shirt. As soon as she saw a car approaching her, she immediately jumped up from her seat and ran to greet the arrivals. Xiao got out of the car and also greeted her. Then she asked if they really had arrived at the address and if there was a stronghold here. The girl confirmed this. Then she called out to a certain Olivia, her colleague at the counter. The two of them went to the counter and simultaneously began to get acquainted. Xiao said that they were from Sendu. The coordinator immediately asked and noted that those who wanted to treat people were going there. Xiao confirmed this. While they were talking about how someone had come there from Tibet for the first time, the guy got out of the car and started looking around. The girl was leading her charge and shouting to her colleague that newcomers had arrived from Tibet. The guy behind them started to follow the girls. At the counter, the girls' colleagues were two American girls, one pale with blonde hair and the other dark-skinned. They greeted Xiao. The girl introduced the blonde one as Olivia and said that she was the administrator of the American outpost in Beijing. Then they asked what the new girl's name was. She extended her hand and introduced herself to Jiang Xiaoye, and they shook hands. By that time, a guy had already approached them, and Xiaoye introduced him as Slowdown, continuing to laugh at him. Olivia didn't get the joke and, smiling respectfully, noted that his name was very unusual and also shook his hand. Then she offered to follow her. But the guy interrupted their route with his question. Apologizing, he addressed her in English and expressed a desire to ask a question. She listened to him further, and he asked how long ago people had appeared in Beijing. She told him that people had always been here, and that last year, they had founded a local stronghold, which had more than 300,000 people. The guy told her that he had come to Beijing twice, and had not met a single living person there. Xiaoye noticed that he brought a vase from Beijing and made a pot out of it, addressing those present. Then the girls laughed together at this. He just looked at them in bewilderment. The administrator of the point continued the conversation with the guy and suggested that perhaps at that moment he was just unlucky because the city had sharply reduced its population from 20 million to 500,000 people, and therefore he did not notice anyone. He continued to answer her that it was impossible. He had visited many places and had even been to Brussels, but he had not seen anyone anywhere. Olivia turned to him and asked again about Brussels. He realized that he had said something wrong and apologized for his English, but the fact remained obvious to him and he tried to convey it to the administrator. For 3 whole years he did not meet a single living soul, not once. He looked at her and asked where they all came from so suddenly. The guy explained to her that it was impossible to appear in the city so suddenly and claimed that they had lived there for so long before that. He turned to her and asked what really happened. Olivia listened to him and asked with disbelief whether she understood correctly that he had traveled all over Eurasia without a navigator or Google. He was offended by such questions. He frowned and asked if she really didn't believe him. The female administrators exchanged meaningful glances with each other and said nothing. The girl with a tail on her side replied that she didn't believe him. Standing before them and realizing that it was impossible for him to prove to them what he was saying, he sighed in despair. Then he turned back to them and said he wanted to ask one more question. The guy asked about men. Did they all die out? And to this day, not a single living one has been found anywhere in the world. Then, without waiting for an answer, he looked at them with a serious face and said, "What if he is a man? Will they believe him or not?" The young girl with the ponytail widened her eyes and looked at him. The American women were also surprised and stared at the guy. Xiao's face was frightened. She didn't quite understand what this attack could lead to. He continued to look at them silently, waiting for an answer. While everyone was silent, a young girl began waving her hand in front of them. He paid attention to her, but she was already bursting with emotions. She couldn't believe it and was delighted. She was happy with this news and said that now she understood why he communicated so strangely. Then she grabbed his hand, screaming that she had touched a real man, after which the girl turned her head away from them, trying to reach everyone in the area, and began to scream that there was a man nearby. She thought that she would never meet any of them again. The guy turned to Olivia and tried to continue his conversation about how he didn't come to Beijing to restore anything. He suddenly stopped, noticing that she was not listening to him. He narrowed his eyes, looking closely at what was happening. Then he turned his head the other way and looked at the girl with the ponytail. She meanwhile took out her phone and started taking pictures of him. Administrator Olivia raised her hand and gestured to the girl that they needed to keep this a secret for now. The girl, as if not listening to her, began frantically digging through her phone and writing to someone, asking why this should be a secret. The guy said that he didn't want everyone to know about it. Meanwhile, the girl was already writing posts about how she had met the only man on Earth. She wrote that he was Chinese and he was standing right in front of her, and the readers couldn't even imagine it. The guy kept looking at her and said that she better remove all of it. Suddenly signals started going off everywhere. Everyone present had hundreds of notifications on their phones. The guy didn't have time to turn around to each one. The girls reached into their pockets for their smartphones. Xiaoye opened her phone and was shocked. The girl with the tail didn't take her eyes off the screen and kept shouting about how cool it was. A look of shock appeared on the guy's face. He realized that she had actually sent all her messages. He abruptly tried to snatch the phone from her hands. Once he had the smartphone in his hands, he stared at the screen and began to read. By this point, there were already a ton of tweets with huge reach discussing the one man. Many people asked where exactly he was and began to talk about how they would soon arrive at the site. However, there were also some women who wanted him dead and considered him a demon who should be killed or sacrificed. He suddenly realized that everything was not going according to his plan and, turning to Olivia, announced that it was time for him to leave. She replied that she understood him and said that they had a hideout in Lianfeng. The guy asked her if the US had really rebuilt society. She answered in the affirmative and said that they had completely restored their people and regained their freedom. He expressed his desire to go to America. She thought for a moment and answered in the affirmative, adding that the government would provide him with protection. Hearing this, the girl with the tail began to be indignant. She did not want him to leave them. Olivia turned to her dark-skinned assistant Kelly and asked her to prepare a car for them and then drive it to Tianjingan. The girl with the tail was furious. She screamed that he was a man from China and he couldn't leave. He didn't deign to answer her, only gave her a quick glance that expressed his contempt. He then turned to Xiaoye and said that it was time for them to leave. He reached out to her and wanted to take her hand, but she dodged it. Xia looked at him innocently with frightened eyes. He didn't understand this reaction and gave her a questioning look. Her eyes became so pitiful that she looked like a little kitten. Then she said she wanted to stay. She said they had to restore everything. The guy frowned and remained silent. He didn't understand how she could react like that. He began to remember moments from the field when she was scared, and he took her face in his hands and promised not to leave her. Sadness appeared on his face. He understood that he had promised not to leave her, but her decision looked like a betrayal. Olivia hugged Xiao and said that she would take care of her. He looked at her for a few more seconds without saying a word. Then, with a calm and sad expression, he looked down and agreed with this. Having thanked her, he turned away and was about to leave. Suddenly, the girl grabbed his hand and tried to stop him. It was a girl with a ponytail. She held him and said that he couldn't just leave. She screamed that he was a Chinese man. He shouted at her and asked her to let go of his hand. The girl did not listen to him and continued to ask if he had really decided to betray his homeland. She grabbed him with both hands and begged him not to leave. He tried to free himself and pulled his hands towards himself. After some time, his patience began to wear thin, and he aggressively declared that he was repeating himself again. He demanded that they immediately take their hands off him. His face turned red with rage. He clenched his teeth and tried to free himself. The girl kept repeating, asking whether he was a man or not. How could he leave his homeland? His eyes filled with anger, and he screamed at her to take her hands off him, his suit beginning to rip at the seams. Eventually, Olivia turned to the girl. Her name was Lisa, and asked him to let her go, since it was not safe for the guy here. Suddenly, they heard a crash. The girl turned to the side to see what was happening. The guy, all red with anger, also looked in the same direction. Cars drove up to the parking lot next to which they were located, knocking down everything around them, and various boxes that were standing in that place flew into the air. These were the same cars with flags standing at the city post. 3 cars drove straight to the control post and stopped nearby. The fox was frightened when she looked at them. She immediately let go of her hands. The guy flew to the ground by inertia. They continued to look at the arriving cars, not understanding what would happen next. One of them began to approach them, and the cries of girls could be heard from there. One of them asked where they were hiding her new husband. For a moment, everyone, including the administrators, froze in silence. The guy looked at his hand. He rolled up the sleeves of his shirt and jacket to see the place where Lisa was holding it. A dark purple bruise in the shape of a girl's hand remained on his arm. He rose from the asphalt. The car from which the screams were coming was decorated as if for newlyweds, and it drove right up to those present. The girl sitting behind the wheel of the car was taken by the hand by her companion, Armia, who was wearing a sparkling ring with a huge diamond, and began to lead her out of the car. She was wearing a short mini dress and high pink heels, which she stepped over the window of her red convertible. She got out and stood on the hood of her car, dressed in a white fluffy fur coat, with a garter with a gun on her legs. The brightly made-up girl narrowed her eyes and looked coquettishly at the guy, mockingly saying that she was going to guess where her man was. Then she confidently pointed her finger at the guy and said that it was him. The army standing nearby smiled slyly in its usual manner and confirmed this. The girl licked her lips, seducing her chosen one. She then stepped forward on the hood, stepping on the pink rose decorations with her shoes. He frowned and looked at this picture in silence. At that moment, Olivia took his hand. She told him not to worry and that everything would be okay. The girl continued to use gestures to try to attract the guy's attention and seduce him. She struck a dramatic pose and sighed languidly, preparing to put on a show. The girl then jumped off her expensive car onto the asphalt and headed towards him. She asked him if he liked their wedding car. Olivia stood up for him and told the girl Mina that this man was under the protection of the United States. Mina ignored her statements and walked towards the guy, asking him where he would like to hold the wedding ceremony, suggesting Shening Palace and Taihei Temple. She told him that their wedding night would be at Chiangkan Palace because she loved their huge bed. His face expressed despair. He didn't know how to react to this. Sweat was running down his face. Mina smiled coquettishly, looking at the guy. Then she laughed loudly, opening her mouth wide. She said she was joking and started laughing at how scared he was. The guy was silent and confused. The girl approached him and the administrator and introduced herself as Jin Ming. Olivia immediately tried to stop her, spreading her hand and saying that she was on U.S. territory. The smile disappeared from the girl's face. She rolled her eyes in displeasure and said that this was China. Then she suddenly pulled out a gun and shot it straight into Olivia's head. The bullet passed through her and her body began to fall to the ground. Blood from the shot splashed across the boy's face. Xiao Yi screamed in horror. Olivia fell at the guy's feet and a pool of blood began to spread around her. Then Mina raised her weapon and pointed the barrel straight at her chosen one. He looked at his feet and was horrified by the shocking picture. There was still smoke coming out of her weapon. She held it confidently, pointing it at the guy. He tried to knock it out of her hands with a sharp movement of his hand. Grabbing her hand, he tried to block her movements. But Mina was a strong girl. She did not let go of the weapon, although he made every effort. She told him ironically how much he had scared her, hinting that he would not be able to stop her anyway. He tried with all his might to grab the gun, and the weapon vibrated in the girl's hand, but it was really not an easy task. Understanding the whole situation, he decided not to waste time, and with a quick movement took out a loaded cartridge case and threw the magazine with bullets out of the pistol. He then raised her hand and tried to snatch the weapon in this way. He pushed her to the ground, twisting her arm holding the gun. The army, watching from afar, was shocked. Other girls gradually began to emerge from the remaining cars. Mina screamed about the pain from his creases, kneeling on the asphalt. Meanwhile, the guy almost snatched the gun from her hands. Then she turned slyly at him, already having come up with a plan of action. Taking advantage of the situation in which he was focused on the weapon, she stood up and tried to knock him down with the strength of her arm. They flew together onto the asphalt. Mina stood her ground, but the guy fell on his back. Now the girl was above him and holding his hand. Looking down at him, she told him that he was too weak. Then she leaned over to the lying man and reminded him that they would have their wedding night that evening. Mina leaned even lower towards his face and asked if he had enough strength for this. He replied that he does not hit women. Looking at her, he clenched his teeth in rage and muttered that she shouldn't make him do this. She just sighed dramatically and, closing her eyes, said that it was very manly. Then she took his hand and tried to put it under her dress. He yelled at her in a rage. Then he suddenly raised his legs, trying to grab her head and neck for a hold. In this way he managed to knock her to the ground, and they froze in an awkward position for him. Between his legs, she smirked and noted that he had masterful movements, and she really liked it. The girls who arrived with her got out of their cars and started laughing, watching this picture and holding their machine guns at the ready. He then said that if she liked this, she would like the next one too, and then changed his position. He rolled over and covered her with his body. Hanging above her head, he tried to wrap his arms, bent at the elbows, around her head. He managed to immobilize her with a chokehold around her neck. She tried to get into that position, but it only made things worse for herself. He held her under the chin and was not going to let go. She began to understand her unpleasant situation. Then he lifted his legs off the ground and wrapped them around her body, hanging from her like a monkey. All the weight fell on her neck, which he had fixed in the grip, and she began to cough. A moment later, her face turned red. She began to gasp. Then her eyes rolled back and she stopped showing signs of life. Her partners were startled, not understanding whether this had actually happened. One of them, leaning on the hood of her car, took a machine gun and shouted at the guy. At that moment, Mina came to her senses. Then, taking advantage of a moment of weakness, she grabbed the guy's hand and tried to free herself. He was not prepared for this and did not pay attention to how cleverly she outwitted him. She was able to easily jerk his hand open. She held it out in front of her and began to twirl it. After which, she stood up on her feet, continuing to hold his hand. Now, standing above him, she was in a preposition and could control the situation. He was kneeling in his suit on the asphalt. She turned to him, looking down at him. His face expressed helplessness. Mina told him that if he were not the last male on Earth, she would not even look at him. Then she thought meaningfully, adopting a confident pose and looking away. These words angered him. He wrinkled his eyebrows and clenched his teeth in rage, holding back the desire to curse. He then yelled at the girl, asking if she really thought he would look at her himself. After these words, he suddenly struck her with his fist. She, as if expecting such a furious gesture, managed to grab him by the wrist. At that moment, he was already ready to strike again. However, her strategic move was more effective and she managed to hit him first. Mina crossed both of his arms at one point and grabbed them together by the wrists. He tried to free himself, but despite the fact that she held him with one hand, he couldn't do it instantly. She held him as if he were defenseless and was in complete control of the situation. After everything that had happened, he was still trying to pull his hand away and loosen Mina's grip. She stood over him, controlling the situation as he tried to catch his breath, and told the guy that he was being absolutely disgusting towards the girl. He did not give up trying and sighed heavily. From the tension, he pressed his lips and his mouth now looked like a straight line. Gritting his teeth, he somehow managed to raise his elbow and his palm trembled. The girl was absolutely calm. Narrowing her eyes, she looked at him with arrogance. Beads of sweat were running down his face. He was still wearing a shirt and jacket, but he was starting to manage to break free, his hand vibrating even more from the tension. Mina realized that she was losing control of the situation, and the serenity left her expression. She pressed her lips together in anger. In this position, the guy managed to get up and, breaking free, he managed to hit the attacker on the leg with his shoe. It didn't help him much, but despite this, he tried to continue kicking. The girl did not express fear. Squinting, she only looked coquettishly at her chosen one. Then she noticed that a shadow from something above began to fall on her face. She looked up, the shadow already eclipsing her face. In front of her, she saw a huge construction bucket from an excavator flying at her from above. Fear appeared on her face. Her eyes filled with horror. She understood that she had to react immediately. The girl jumped to the side, and the huge iron ladle fell onto the asphalt, splitting it into pieces. She rolled head over heels across the roadway, stones from the destroyed surface flying in all directions. Only when she managed to rise and turn her head towards the bucket did she realize that the attack was not yet over. The bucket handle rose up again, and behind the loader sat the dark-skinned assistant administrator, Kelly, who was operating the excavator. Kelly screamed at the guy to hurry up and leave the place quickly. He looked at what was happening in confusion and tried to understand and formulate a further plan of action. The dark-skinned girl told him that he needed to run to the port of Tianjin because there was a ship there sailing to the States. She shouted at him to act faster and not stand still. Everything happened in an instant, and the guy was trying to come to his senses in a rush, listening to the American woman's instructions. He then quickly turned around and ran into the parking lot closer to his car, which was parked in the same place. Mina obviously didn't like this. She frowned and clenched her teeth, deciding to get the guy back quickly. She took off and ran straight after him, past the forklift where Kelly was sitting at the wheel. However, on the way she collided with the excavator bucket and flew off to the side. The bucket almost mixed her into one big pile with the asphalt, continuing to attack. Her legs were millimeters away from being hit by the massive iron structure. Between blows, she managed to move back so that she wouldn't be hit. Seeing her offender, the girl became very angry and cursed, addressing the American. Then, without further ado, she turned to her retinue and ordered them to kill Kelly. The girls happily accepted the order. They were still standing next to their cars and kept their machine guns at the ready, just in case such a situation occurred. One of them, with red hair and pink fluffy headphones, reloaded her weapon and commanded the others to begin carrying out the order. Next to their cars, the girls lined up chaotically and opened fire on the enemy. They all arrived in expensive cars. There were more than 10 of them, and each bullet was aimed at the offender of their queen. Many of them ended up in a huge iron bucket. Kelly noticed that she was under attack and planned to take action. She moved the handle of the bucket so that it blocked her window from the shots. The girls continued shooting while their leader ran towards her chosen one. Bullets were also flying in his direction. He was trying to get to the car as quickly as possible, unharmed. At some point he managed to reach his Geländewagen. He immediately began to open the door to get inside. He realized that time was not on his side, and as soon as he got behind the wheel, he quickly began searching in his pocket for the car keys. With a sharp movement, he started the car and was ready to go. After that, he exhaled heavily, realizing that he could die at any moment. Then he looked to the side, his gaze interested in something. The guy noticed Xiao standing at the entrance to the stronghold, not knowing what to do next and how to get through the gunfire. She stood defenseless by the glass doors, which already had holes from gunshots. The guy thought for a second because he was already in a protected place, but he couldn't leave the girl. He realized that only he himself could save her, and he needed to act as quickly as possible. Cursing at the situation and accepting his fate, he reached for the door handle. He quickly jumped out of the car and ran towards the girl standing at the door of the building. On the way, he had to cross the road. Shots were flying in his direction, and he deftly maneuvered among the bullets. When he was already approaching Xiao, he confidently shouted at her, urging her to obey and follow him. The guy grabbed her hand and dragged her back to the car. The girl with the tail and the purple t-shirt appeared on their way again. She didn't want him to leave this place. Realizing the absurdity of the whole situation and her requests, he did not hold back and sent her away, after which he hit her in the face with a wrench, which he grabbed with him when he ran out of the car. The girl fell to the ground. A drop of blood spurted from her nose from the blow. She lost consciousness, while the heroes ran to their goal. Watching what was happening, Mina commanded her team to keep their focus on the guy and follow him. The girls quickly moved towards the cars and took their places, preparing to set off. The guy holding Xiao's hand tried to run to their car in time, while the shooters were already moving towards them in their huge cars. Kelly was also driving the backhoe and trying to protect the man. She raised the bucket high above the cars of the aggressive girls and was ready to strike. With great force, the bucket flew into the roof of a passing Range Rover, behind which Mina was located. The American woman hit the target directly, tearing the roof of the car, causing the window glass to crack and crumble. An enraged Mina, watching the scene unfolding before her, decided to take action. She then loaded the huge machine gun in her hands to fire. After this, Mina, cursing at the foreigner, rushed towards her. By this time, Kelly had already lifted the car into the air, hooking the bucket onto its roof. Mina, wearing pink heels, jumped onto the windshield of the forklift with a weapon in her hands. Only glass separated her from Kelly. She pointed the machine gun at her and took aim, wanting her dead. The assistant administrator of the stronghold was also not an ordinary girl. Without fear or anxiety, she began to move the handle of the bucket to throw off the aggressor. Mina's eyes widened. She didn't expect such calmness and composure from the girl. She turned around sharply. The huge iron mechanism was already approaching her. On top of everything else, there was also a car hanging on the bucket with her teammates, flying towards her at great speed. She had literally a moment to change her position in front of the heavy flying car. A second later, the car crashed noisily into the forklift's windshield with all its weight. Xiao and her boyfriend had already gotten into their car by that time. She immediately turned to her goat Abu. The boyfriend asked her to quickly close the door and fasten her seatbelt. She looked at him obediently. Then she began to follow the instructions, reaching for the handle of the open car door. At this time, the army managed to run up to the door and prevented the girl from closing it, greeting her sarcastically. Hearing her voice, the guy turned around abruptly and, making a displeased face, cursed. He realized that it was time to leave quickly and instantly pressed the gas pedal. By inertia, the army, holding on to the handle of the open door, flew after the car. She screamed at those sitting in it and demanded that they take her with them, not even understanding where they were going. Xiaoye looked at her in horror and asked her to let go of the door handle. In response to this, the girl tried to gain her trust and began to tell her how good she really was and that she was no longer with Mina's team. Xiao was very angry at her and screamed that it was she who told her group about the guy and put everyone at such risk. The purple-haired girl continued to say that she could take the newcomers to the south and show them a new place that was different from Beijing. The guy had already started to speed up, but the army was still holding on to the door, racing along with them. She said that she had hidden many interesting things in the south that she could show them. It was already becoming difficult for her to hold on, and she asked to take her with her and start living together, the three of them. Her face literally lit up with the idea, and she looked at Xiao with wide eyes, describing their future life as 2 wives and 1 husband. For a moment, Xiaoye even thought about it and continued to silently look at the speaker's face. The guy apparently heard these conversations, but he wasn't even going to react to them and, without turning around, drove the car. The army said that they would get to the land of bliss and life would become much better. She talked about how they would enjoy each other. At this point, the guy was already tired of listening to her fantasies. He sent her, and with a sharp movement swerved to the side, trying to throw the girl onto the road. She didn't expect this, and really barely managed to hold on to the door, her slippers flying into the air. Xiaoye got angry and stretched out her leg towards her palm, trying to kick it to get it to come off. Pinning her hand with a small heel, she was close to throwing the girl off. Both of Army's hands were in the air. She screamed, realizing the hopelessness of her situation. In an instant, she managed to catch hold of the protruding hoof of Xiaoye's goat. The girl screamed and hugged the animal, trying to prevent the offender from taking her away. The army hung, holding on to the leg of the goat, which she had just asked to be given to her. The guy looked in the rearview mirror with displeasure and noticed what was happening. He began to swerve even harder, steering the car to throw off the restless girl. She flew along with the car at great speed and, holding Abu, said that she would take the animal and it would belong to her. The goat started bleeding. Xiao was terrified. She held the pet with all her might and asked to let her go. The guy tried to throw off the army. She flew from side to side, dangling behind the car, but still did not let go of the hoof. He realized that he couldn't get rid of her and decided that turning wasn't going to help with that. The guy pressed the gas pedal harder, expecting it to fly off due to the speed. The army knew exactly what he was doing and said that she was not as easy to get rid of as they thought. She added that there was nothing in Beijing that she did not know. The poor animal bleated in pain. Xiaoye turned red from the strain as she continued to hold her. The girl frowned her purple eyebrows and said that she would take the pet anyway. The boy shouted at Xiaoye to let go of Abu. Tears began to well up in the girl's eyes. She didn't mean to do this. She continued to wrestle with Army for the animal as it tried to get its other hand on the car door again. She failed to do this, and she began to get very angry, trying to grab hold of something in her rage. The boy insistently demanded that Xiaoye release the goat immediately. She began to cry, not wanting to give up her pet. The boy shouted that if this was not done, the animal could die. Foam came out of Abu's mouth. The owner cried, hugging the poor animal. She couldn't stop. She felt sorry that Abu was suffering in vain. Xiaoye screamed hysterically, unable to contain her emotions. The poor animal suffered greatly. Abu's eyes began to close. The girl realized that she had no other choice and let her pet go. The army itself did not expect such an outcome. It widened its eyes in fear and flew back. Together with the animal, they fell onto the asphalt road along which the car was driving. Xiaoye pulled her legs up and covered her face with her hands, beginning to cry. The car pulled ahead, leaving everyone behind. The girl couldn't stop crying. Tears were streaming down her face and hands. The guy looked at her through the mirror without saying a word. Xiao snapped at the young man, blaming him for everything that happened. She started throwing things around in the car, including boxes and canned goods, and she was furious. The girl couldn't understand why he didn't stop when there was a threat of losing his pet. One of the tin cans hit the guy right in the head. His forehead wrinkled from the impact, and he silently continued driving. In her sadness, the girl hung her head down, wiping the tears from her face with her hands. She said that Abu was her own, unlike the young man, and leaned against the cardboard box, continuing to grieve. In response to her accusations, the guy only glanced at the girl reflected in the rearview mirror. Suddenly, he turned his attention to the side mirror and noticed something in the distance. Their car was chased by cars from the rest of the female gang. He cursed, realizing that they would have to fight them again. Among the cars catching up was the very same red wedding convertible in which Mina was standing. When they approached the guy's window, Mina greeted him, already calling him her husband. He did not pay attention to her. From the back seat, Xiao shouted at them, asking where her goat was. The army was driving the convertible, and with a satisfied and sly look, she answered the girl that the animal was okay, and asked her to stop their car so that they could all go back together to get the pet. Out of anger, Xiaoye began throwing objects from their boxes at her. The army didn't care. She deftly fought off the bottles flying at her and, smiling, continued to drive the car. Meanwhile, Mina asked her chosen one where he was going to run. She tried to explain to him the essence of things, which, in her opinion, he still could not understand. As she gradually approached his car, she reminded him that he was the last man on earth, adding that she is considered the queen in those places, hinting that they are perfect for each other. She gestured with her open palms in front of her, trying to prove that she had no intention of harming him. Clenching her fists, Mina insisted that the couple was destined for each other. She added that together, they can create their own kingdom. Seeing absolutely no reaction from the young man, she shouted indignantly, reminding everyone of her presence. He drove the car with concentration. Then, without turning around, he began to lower his window. Then he turned to her and replied in a serious tone that he didn't like the Dongbei people. This answer simply infuriated Mina. She made a displeased face and turned to him. Then, with a menacing look, she informed him that he was obliged to love her as she was. She ordered their second car to overtake the guy from the other side. The girls obeyed and began to maneuver to the right of the Geländewagen. Having drawn level with him, he ironically greeted the guy through the passenger seat window. He indignantly asked them if they were really going to race with him. With a sharp movement, he turned the steering wheel and began to turn left. He crashed into a convertible coming from the other side, and Mina, who was standing inside, fell inside. He began to brake sharply. Finding himself a little behind the girls' cars, he was about to implement a new plan. Looking through the mirror at the edge of the car, he decided to move closer. The distance between the cars was decreasing. Then, having calculated the right moment, he pressed the gas pedal. His car was already driving almost right next to the neighboring one. Then, with a sharp movement, he turned the steering wheel towards her. He rammed and crashed into the girl's wheel. Their car swerved on the road as the driver tried to regain control. The guy continued to ram the group, and after a while, their car began to rise from the ground. He then managed to flip the huge Jeep, which flew into the barrier. The car broke through the fence and rolled head over heels across the field at great speed. Noticing this, Mina stood on the edge of the convertible again. Approaching her chosen one, she admired his skill. The girl complimented the young man on his abilities and was determined to get him. Taking the starting position, she jumped between the cars and expected to land on its roof. She asked the guy to teach her this driving technique and quickly approached his window. Mina grabbed the roof of the car with her hands and placed her feet on the protruding parts of the car near the wheels. Unable to bear such madness, he turned around and shouted at her that she was completely insane. She liked it. The girl began to smile coquettishly, looking at him through the glass, and said that she was doing all this for him. Then she began to pull one of her hands back, after which she slammed it into the passenger window glass, creating a huge crack. Having punched a hole in it, she calmly tore out the crumbling glass and threw it away. Xiao turned to the side after hearing a new noise. Motorcycles appeared on the road behind the cars. Mina turned around, looking at the girls sitting behind the wheel. Following in the distance were 7 bikes carrying members of another local gang. The girl narrowed her eyes, not understanding whether reinforcements were coming for the man. She, one of the short-haired motorcyclists, turned to Jing Ming. She also greeted Bygone and said that she herself had been looking for them for a long time and could not catch them. She did not understand why they decided to come to her personally. Bygone replied that they were doing men's work. To this, Mina only smirked, saying that these girls were no different from her and there was no need to pretend to be men. Meanwhile, the army had already begun to take out a machine gun for an attack from the seat next to it. Still sitting behind the wheel, she stood up, holding the gun in one hand and turned around, opening fire on her pursuers. One of the girls flew to the side of the road. The others tried to catch up with the shooter. The motorcycle circled the convertible from the other side, preparing to attack her from the front. The girl sitting on him took out a fire extinguisher and began to pull out a hose. She then pointed it at the army and sprayed it, creating an opaque cloud around the car. The driver found herself behind the wheel of a car with absolutely no visibility. Another girl on a motorcycle had already prepared a snake of explosives and was about to throw it into the convertible. The fuse on this explosive garland had already been lit. She swung it and, taking advantage of the army's helplessness, released the explosive. The girl, horrified, saw the danger only when the tape was already flying in her direction. She screamed in fear as she felt firecrackers exploding at her feet. Then she tried to get up to get out of the car, whose windshield was all white from the fire extinguisher. But having lost control, her convertible flew into the barrier and she, along with the machine gun, began to fly out of it. After the impact, her car flipped over and flew into the oncoming lane. The girl and her smoking car were left out of the race while the rest of the participants rushed forward. Turning back to the convertible as it flew away, Mina said that this was just child's play for her. Then, leaning on the roof of the car, she addressed Bygone, calling her an underman. The girl turned her gaze to her, listening attentively, a pendant with a phallic symbol dangling from her neck. Mina encouraged her to take the risk and come closer to her. Then, in her heels, the girl climbed all the way onto the roof of the car and shouted at Bygone to do a man's job. Meanwhile, the short-haired girl in the passenger seat motioned to the bike driver that it was time to use the weapon they were carrying with them, which was a throwing harpoon with a sharp hook on the end. The girl holding the gun took aim, pointing it at Mina, who was standing on the roof. Then, taking aim, the girl in the helmet pulled the trigger. The tip of the rope flew towards the target at great speed. The guy turned to face the shooters, noticing that a shell was flying in his direction, and horror appeared on his face. Sitting behind the wheel and cursing, he tried to dodge the hook that was flying straight at him. He managed to dodge to the opposite side of the cabin when the tip had already reached the frame of his window. The mount caught on it and fit tightly into the grooves, and a taut rope appeared between the bike and the car. Bygone began to rise from her seat, grabbing the huge axe that was attached to the passenger seat. She stood up and took a step, placing her foot on the tightly stretched rope. After which she walked along it skillfully and confidently, reaching the car. The guy didn't know what to do. He thought that the girl with the axe was a new danger for him. He looked at her, then at the hook, and tried to take it off. On the way, she turned to him and informed him that her team was on his side. Then she swung her axe, making a furious face. And she decided to attack Mina, who was waiting for her on the roof of the car, on the fly. The girl managed to dodge, and the axe flew right over her head when her opponent landed next to her. She tried to attack her again, swinging her weapon, but Mina managed to avoid the blow. The guy, looking back at his roof, shouted that he had encountered a bunch of crazy women in this place. Another blow from the short-haired girl flew past Mina's head by centimeters. She kept throwing punches and still couldn't hit the target, even when she was dealing with a really strong opponent. Taking advantage of another moment of her swing, Mina reached for the pistol attached to the strap on her leg. She then took aim and pointed the gun at Bygone. The girl moved away and the bullet flew past her neck. Mina continued shooting at her from a meter away. Their fight with a pistol and an axe on the roof of the Glenwagen continued for some time. The opponents were equal. At the same time, the guy was already getting pretty tired of this, and an idea came into his head. Through the sunroof, he could see a fight between angry women. He decided that no matter which of them was on his side, he needed to get rid of the girls. Mina, meanwhile, began to use her legs in combat. The guy braked abruptly. By inertia, the girls flew forward. However, Bygone managed to sit down and stay in her place. Mina flew down on her back. She rounded the roof and dropped her gun. It flew to the side. The girl flipped over and landed on the hood of the car. She managed to catch hold of the windshield wipers and remain on the hood. Smiling coquettishly at the driver, she asked him if he had really decided to go against her. Then, getting up on one knee, she was about to go back to the roof to her opponent, telling the guy that she would talk to him about this again in the evening. She reached the roof in a jump and was ready to continue what she had started. Disarmed, she charged at Bygone using combat strikes. The girl defended herself with her axe while her team began shooting at Mina from the road to knock her down. The arrows that the girls fired from the crossbow flew past Mina. The guy watched the progress of their cancer through the panoramic window of the hatch. He tried to speed up the process and pressed the brake again. The girls began to stagger. He then stepped on the gas and began alternating pedals to throw the women off. Mina was very angry. She turned to the guy, asking if he had really decided to join forces with the rival Bygone team. Then she raised her foot with her sharp heel and was about to break the window. With a strong and fast downward blow, she broke through the hatch and hit the driver right in the bridge of the nose. Blood spurted from the wound. The guy tried to cover his face with his hand while shards of glass rained down on him from above. Bygone took advantage of the moment and aimed her axe at Ming with a powerful blow. The girl was not prepared for this, and in horror noticed the blow only when the weapon was already near her. A moment later, she screamed in pain. The axe hit the area of her back, where a white fluffy fur coat hung. She arched forward from the blow. Then the girl began to gradually turn towards the axe. She noticed that he had torn her fur coat and was stuck in it. Mina was incredibly furious that her opponent had ruined her thing. She turned around and delivered a powerful kick, hitting Bygone. The girl's body spun around and flew to the side. As she fell from the car, she managed to grab onto the roof with her hands. Xiaoye climbed out of the window to catch and embrace the girl. Mina picked up her axe and swung it, standing on the roof above Bygone's palms. The guy noticed this and decided to continue his method with pedals. She swung the axe downwards. He slammed on the brakes. Mina flew to the side, her heels sliding across the surface of the car. Bygone decided to grab her leg with her hand. It caught on her shoe, causing Mina to lose her balance. The guy abruptly swerved to the right. Mina flew down, dropping the axe from her hands. She began to realize that she had no well-thought-out plan for this eventuality. Then, flying in horror, she turned to her chosen one. He, with a bloody nose, looked at her with displeasure and did not say a word. In flight, Mina noticed a taut rope along which her rival walked. She managed to grab it and jumped back straight at the biker, kicking her in the helmet. The girl then pushed off the bike and jumped back onto the roof towards Bygone. The guy was shocked that she managed to survive and that this would continue again. Mina flew with a fist at the short-haired girl. In response, she put up a block to defend the blow. Mina continued to strike endlessly and could not hit her opponent. The guy raised his head to the hatch and realized that everything had started again. A girl in heels stood above him, shining with her charms in a short dress. He was terribly tired of all this. He looked for another way and began to spin from side to side, trying to find a suitable object. Xiaoye raised a wrench and a screwdriver, offering these options. His gaze fell on the tip of the spear to which the rope was tied. The weapon that had been used to shoot him was dragged along the road behind his car on a rope. He realized that he needed to get it and use it. There was a sign above the highway on the road ahead, and he came up with a brilliant idea. He began to pull on the rope, trying to lift the weapon. Above him was still Mina, with a fur coat with a hole left by her rival fluttering on her back. Then, once the weapon was in his hands, he retuned it and wound the rope back inside. He took the charged device in his hands and pointed it upward. Through the hatch, the guy aimed straight at the girl's fur coat. Mina was caught up in fighting Bygone and didn't notice his actions. The opponent still managed to dodge her endless blows. However, her hands, holding onto the edge of the car, were already beginning to tremble from the tension, and the girl understood that she would soon fall. The guy took a long time to aim and waited for the right moment. Meanwhile, the car had already approached the sign hanging over the road. He turned his attention to it. And then he pulled the trigger and fired the harpoon at the target. A rope with a sharp tip flew up through the hatch. As the hook approached the girl, she lowered her head and saw in horror it flying between her legs. The girl screamed at the guy and cursed at him, but it was too late. The hook passed through the hole in her coat and flew on. Its tip flew so fast that in a moment it was above the girl. She looked at it and did not understand why it was necessary. Eventually the hook reached the shield that the car approached. He caught hold of it, forming a taut rope. Her face conveyed horror. She understood the original plan of this attack. Bygone, with a broken lip, also watched what was happening. When the tip reached its target, the boy realized it was time to take action. He let go of the weapon, and it flew upward by inertia. The device got stuck in the torn fur coat and pulled Mina along with it. The car continued moving forward, passing the shield, so it flew off the roof along with the weapon and hung there. The guy was very happy that his plan had come true, and was happy to say goodbye to the crazy girl. Bygone exhaled and wiped the blood from her split lip. The mine remained hanging over the road behind them. The short-haired girl watched her for a while, and suddenly Mina found a way to deal with the situation. She climbed out of the sleeves of her fur coat and, taking it off, flew down and landed on the road. Then she took off her shoes, removing her pink ones. With a leisurely movement, she threw them to the side and assumed a running stance. She turned her gaze on her opponent, her eyes full of vengeance. Bygone was horrified by what she saw. Mina picked up speed and started running towards the car. The girl standing on the roof began asking the driver to speed up. She leaned towards the hatch and, turning to the guy, repeated the demand to press the gas harder. He was already terribly tired of this chase and decided to ask Xiaoye to get behind the wheel. When she grabbed the steering wheel, he climbed into the back seat. Having changed places, he decided to open the trunk door. They, together with Bygone, who was sitting on the roof, saw an angry Mina running towards them. He began to throw the boxes that were in the trunk at her with all his might. On top of everything else, he even threw out gas tanks in an attempt to knock the girl off her feet. Canned goods and bottles with boxes flew past. She skillfully ran around all the obstacles. As she approached one of the motorbikes trailing behind the car, the girl sitting in the passenger seat took out a poker and began swinging it at Mina. She immediately grabbed the piece of iron and tried to hit the girl back. By force, she managed to knock the girl off her feet and throw her over herself to the side. The boy roared fiercely as he raised another fuel tank above his head, preparing to throw it forward. The shell flew straight into Mina's face. However, she deftly brushed him off and continued running without losing her pace. After a while, she approached the car. By that time, the guy had almost no other items left. Trapped, he squeezed into the rear seats behind him, with the trunk wide open. Baigan was already ready to come to his aid and attack the girl from above. Mina was focused, and only a moment remained before she reached her target. The guy looked at her approaching face in horror, his eyes filled with fear. Mina's face was red and sweat was running down it, her brows furrowed as she tried to make one last push. But suddenly tears started flowing from her eyes, and she began to choke. The girl realized that her strength was running out and began to cry from fatigue. Her legs couldn't take the strain, and she began to stop. The girl stayed behind the car and tried to admit her loss. She stopped on the road and doubled over in exhaustion, trying to catch her breath. Then she collapsed to the ground from exhaustion. She began to sob, leaning over the asphalt, her tears and sweat streaming down her face. After that, Mina arched her back and screamed like a ferocious animal that had been defeated. The guy continued to watch this, sitting in front of the open trunk door of the moving car. When they had already gone far, the remaining girls on bikes caught up with the car, and everyone decided to stop. Baigan jumped from the roof of the Geländewagen towards the rest of her team. Seeing this, the guy put his hand forward and screamed furiously, demanding that they not come near him. He asked the girls what they wanted from him, to which they replied that they were a male group from a partisan detachment in northern China. He tried to explain himself more clearly and asked who exactly they were and what had happened. Baigan looked at him seriously and said that they were the same men as he was. The guy called this statement nonsense and angrily called them transvestites. She went on to explain to him that her group represented men in the time and circumstances they found themselves in. Another girl was outraged by his reaction and repeated that they were real men, just like him. The guy looked at them, realizing the absurdity of the situation, and said nothing. He then turned to the leader of the group and asked her if he could leave. Baigan demanded that he stay and fight with them for men's rights. He turned away and held his hand out in front of them, gesturing that he was tired of all this, then said that he was not going to fight and just wanted to come to his senses. He could no longer bear the nightmare that was happening around him and said, knocking on his forehead, that his head was about to explode. The girl answered him that this is a woman's world, and men have a very difficult time in it. She continued to insist on fighting. The guy waved it off and said that he had more important things to do. Another blonde girl from the crowd decided to speak up, saying that they needed him. She said that for them, he is a spiritual banner. The girls looked at him in confusion and despair, with their pitiful eyes. He narrowed his eyes and decided that there was only one way out. Then he asked again if he could go already. Baigan looked at him with confusion and did not give an answer. She took a step, placing her foot under his wheel. The guy was already exhausted from the anger that had taken hold of him. He grabbed the gear shift lever and was about to move off. Then the girl came closer to his window and picked up her phallic medallion around her neck. She took it off and handed it to the driver. The girl said that wherever he goes, they will help him organize his own group. He took it in his hands with a serious expression, continuing to look at his interlocutor. Then he decided to play along with the girls so that he could leave them sooner. After which he prudently pointed his finger at the weapon hanging on the shoulder of one of them and asked her to give it to him. They took out their weapons without further questions and agreed to hand them over. Then he demanded that they share the fuel with him. When he had taken another gun, canned food, water, napkins, and ammunition from them, he was ready to go, having replenished his supplies. He then thanked Baigan in a brotherly manner, gesturing with his fist towards her chest. Then he brought it to his chest and thanked the others, addressing them as brothers. He began to beat his chest and yell, paying tribute to the good of the male group. After which, the guy put his fist forward and said that he would fight for the sake of men. He then hit the gas and drove away quickly, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. The girls were speechless from such a performance and continued to watch him. Then they rejoiced, and raising their helmets upward, began to fire ceremonial shots into the sky and shout "Long live men." The girls were happy, and seemed to have achieved what they wanted. Xiao looked at them through the rear window from the passenger seat and noticed that they were happy to see him. Addressing the guy, he could finally breathe a sigh of relief and dismissively called them a bunch of crazies. The girl then turned to him and asked where they were going. He replied that he was going to return to Linda. She didn't like this answer and started asking if he still wanted to go back to America and sleep with someone. The guy had no intention of responding to such nonsense and didn't take his eyes off the road. Xiaoye screamed that she was not going to let him go. On the road, signs about the nearest junctions and settlements appeared in front of the driver's eyes. The guy suggested returning to Linda. The girl looked at him questioningly, waiting to see which road he would decide to take. The guy decided to go straight, which meant he changed his mind. As the girl continued to ask where they were ultimately heading, the boy began to remember what the army had once told him about the south of the country and how much it was different from where it was now. He decided to go there, and after a while, they reached the bridge dividing the northern and southern parts of the country. On the way, they managed to stop at a store and change the guy into women's clothes. He rode in a wig, skirt, and makeup, while Xiao scrolled through the news on her phone. She told him that on the internet all the girls are interested in what clothes the only man on earth likes. He answered with expressed displeasure, and ironically that it was a bikini. In the meantime, they drove onto the bridge, and in front of them again, there was a series of barriers preventing them from driving further. The guy got out of the car and asked the girl to stay inside and wait for him. There was no one near the fences, and he went there to look around and perhaps open the way for them. He moved forward cautiously, taking the pistol with him from the car. Flags of a local group hung on the bridge. The guy started moving the barrier fences and various building materials lying around. Suddenly, a noise was heard from above. Someone threw a rope over the metal frame of the bridge. Then girls began to descend from the bridge along ropes fixed at the top and hanging down. They descended lower and lower towards the road. There were about 5 of them in total. The guy looked up at them in amazement and realized that this place was an ambush. He rushed towards the car, ordering Xiao to get behind the wheel and accelerate faster from this place. As he approached the open door of his car, he noticed that 2 cars had already appeared behind it, approaching the fence. The guy understood that they had nowhere to go. They were surrounded on all sides, and he was at a loss. He then decided to take action. Armed with a pistol, he shouted, urging them to risk coming to him. After a while, the guy and Xiao were already handcuffed and kneeling, surrounded by girls with machine guns from an unfamiliar group. One of them, a red-haired girl, asked them where they came from. Without thinking twice, Xiao replied that they were from Beijing, and the guy with her said that they were from Yanzhou. Then they looked at each other, realizing that their information did not match each other. The bandits immediately understood everything and grabbed them, brought them to the edge of the bridge. Bending them face down, the guy tried to justify himself and shouted that they were not spies and definitely not from Beijing. The girls then began to clear out their trunk and throw out empty gas tanks. From their numbers, they could tell that the visitors were definitely from the north, having spent more than 200 liters of fuel on the road. The main red-haired girl ordered her subordinates to throw the prisoners off the bridge. The guy in women's clothing tried to convince them at the last moment, while the girls were pushing him over the bridge. His body was already hanging over the water, but he managed to shout to the girls, trying to tell them his last words. He screamed that he was a man. By that time, 2 more cars had driven up to the bridge, and he noticed this. Taking a closer look at the numbers, he realized where they were coming from, and immediately turned to Xiaoya. He demanded that she quickly say something in the Suzhou dialect, since the cars were from there. They kept her close to him, but she replied that she did not know such a dialect. He began to go through the dialects of neighboring provinces and asked her to say something from the Shanghai dialect. Xiaoye thought about it and realized that this could be their salvation. She immediately shouted out, using Shanghainese dialect, that she was in fact born there. Suddenly the girl stopped and she continued shouting, repeating that she came from Shanghai. Then the red-haired girl, who was the leader of the group, raised her palm, gesturing to the others to stop following the order and leave the prisoners. She asked to bring the 2 of them to her. After some time, they were all already riding in the girl's car, which was transporting the captives to an unknown destination. The peeling signs along the way said that Suzhou lay ahead, not a city, but a paradise on earth. They arrived at the old temple and stopped near it. Then the girl led the guy outside by the arms. He raised his head, looking at the structure in front of him. Xiaoye was also surprised by what she saw. At the entrance, there was a majestic gate in traditional Chinese style, and a sign said that this was the Jianan Temple. A group of girls led the captives inside, passing by the servants who were there. One of them, the red-haired girl Hun, asked where Qinya was. She replied that she was in the courtyard. They walked through the courtyard. It was clean and beautiful around, bright greenery and a pond with stone sculptures. The temple workers were dressed in traditional Chinese clothing and walked slowly around, whispering to each other. As he passed by, the guy turned around to look at 2 of them. As they approached the pavilion where Qinya was, they began to hear lines from poems about nature, the stars, and the moon. The girls' ringing laughter was heard all around. The guy was trying to understand what was happening around him. It seemed they were reading poetry in turns. The gazebo was called Pleasant Breeze. Several girls were sitting in it. Food was neatly laid out on plates on the table, and little pandas were jumping around. Hun turned to the head attendant Qinya and said that her team had captured 2 strange girls. Then she pushed a guy in women's clothing towards the gazebo. The nun looked at them humbly, without saying a word, dressed in a long, minimalist kimono in keeping with Chinese traditions. Having caught his breath, the guy looked at the woman from under his brows with displeasure, not understanding what would happen to him next. She narrowed her eyes and studied the new arrivals. The boy and Xiao were confused and waited for further developments. Then, with a slight smile on her face, the nun turned to the guy in the wig and asked if he was really the man everyone was talking about. The girls in the gazebo were shocked by such insight of their servant and turned their gaze to the man. The red-haired Hun's eyes widened in surprise. She realized that she had not paid attention to the guy's words on the bridge and had not been able to understand this earlier. The guy, surprised by the servant's abilities, asked her how she understood this. She meekly replied that he smelled like a man. He thought for a second and decided to secretly sniff himself. The girls in the gazebo noticed this and began to giggle quietly. Then the nun invited him to come in and sit at their table. The guy and Xiaoye were not prepared and had already become unaccustomed to such a warm welcome. Temple maid Qinya, pouring tea into cups, assured him that he had nothing to worry about and that she treated him the same as everyone else. He still felt like there was something fishy about this after everything that had happened to him that day. He then raised his hands, pointing to the handcuffs hanging on him. After their hands were freed, they went into the gazebo, and the guy began to take off his wig along the way. Hun couldn't take her eyes off the man. She was delighted by this news. She cutely pounced on Xiaoye's legs from the pandas. The girls at the table told the guests that they were playing impromptu poetry and invited them to join in. Then one of those present, with a slight movement of her hand, tore off a sheet of paper from the calendar hanging on the column. Each page in this calendar represented a certain object or phenomenon with which a poem had to be composed. The first one was a flower. The girl read it and reported it. The maid began to compose first. She came up with a line about how in the flower room, the jug of wine was fragrant and tender. The guy continued to take off his women's things and said that he did not know how to compose poetry. Xiaoye decided to participate and said that the petals were flying over the beautiful river, turning it into a big flower, to which the nun smiled and praised the girl. The guy looked at the table full of delicious food and asked if he could eat. The girls nodded approvingly and began to offer him delicacies. He couldn't decide where to start, while the nun sitting next to him continued to make up poems about osmanthus flowers. Meanwhile, with her arms crossed in displeasure over her chest, Hun continued to watch the guest from afar, leaning against the column of the gazebo. The girls inside rushed to praise their food and take turns offering it to the guy to try. There was apple pie and shan loquat with buns on the table. The attendant Qinya asked the girls not to take everything at once. Having stuffed his mouth with various foods, the boy asked the nun if she really considered him the same as everyone else, and if she was able to let him go. She replied that no one was holding him there, and he could leave on his own at any time. Hun was shocked by this statement. Her eyes widened in horror. The guy, not believing his luck, asked Qinya again if she was really telling the truth. While the guy was finishing his drink, the attendant turned to him and informed him that there was one condition for his leaving. She smiled sweetly and looked at him, ready to make a joke. Then she said that if he wanted to have a snack, he would have to beat her in poetry. He turned to look at her with displeasure after this statement, expressing his incomprehension. On the column, the next word for poetry was heart. The girls around screamed, asking the attendant for permission to speak first. As she sipped her tea, she noticed that they all wanted to start at the same time. One of the girls stepped in and said that they wanted to get the man's heart and not share his old age. The guy continued to taste the dishes and snacks placed on the table, then turned to Xiaoye. She looked at the girls and said that there was no intention of being smart and sophisticated. The other girl spread her arms as if dancing, the wide sleeve of her dress hanging from them right on the man. She continued the poem. As if not noticing him, she continued to move, hanging her sleeve over the guest's face, reciting more and more lines about the incessant flow of day and night. Then he himself decided to speak out and read a line about the sad writings of Qin and Han when palaces were created from the earth. The attendant Qinya was surprised by his initiative and skills and cast an interested glance at him. Another girl approached the man and began to spin around him, continuing to recite poetry. Then she touched his back with her hand, sliding it gently. Hun, who was watching from the side, frowned and was ready to speak out. She said that the old man's heart was not like that of the travelers. He did not envy either the fairy or the young man. Another girl came up to the guy and started dancing around him, showing off the smooth lines of her figure, but he wasn't interested in it and didn't even turn around, continuing to eat. The girl hung her robe on him, and he understood that everywhere he was like a doll, with whom he could do whatever he wanted. The girls in the gazebo began to giggle again as they watched this scene. He continued the poem with words about leaving the cup and throwing away the chopsticks, drawing the sword, and not getting confused around. The attendant Qinya was delighted, only his lines seemed to her to be the most profound and talented. He did not raise his head to those present and added that it was impossible to get rid of this feeling. He was calming down, but his heart was like a gray tree and his body like an untied boat. Impressed, the nun did not say a word and continued to silently watch him with a surprised expression on her face. At that time, the girl who was dancing around the man pressed her lips to his cheek and said that she only wished for his heart to belong to hers. She whispered in his ear that he was definitely worthy of love's longing. Xiao continued, asking how it was possible to serve the dignitaries while forcing oneself not to receive joy. The girls around began to weave intrigues and construct poems in such a way as to seduce the only man. He offered his line, saying that although he was old in years, he was filled with high aspirations. Then he added that even in the declining years of warriors, their aspirations will not weaken. The girl in the gazebo began to ask if what he was talking about applied to him. She was delighted with him. Then Chinya got tired of her subordinate's desire and ordered them to stop and not tease the guest. She added that they all just show off in front of a man and push him to sin, to which the girls replied that without this, they are bored communicating with him because guys are so boring. The maid approved of the guy's intentions and told him to continue eating, and then she would escort the guests to the exit. Hun could no longer contain herself and indignantly turned to the nun, saying that he could not just leave like that. He turned with disdain to the red-haired leader of the group. The attendants replied that he was an adult, and he would decide for himself whether to leave or stay. Hun added that the man is their main asset in the northern expedition. Chinya replied that the northern expedition was their personal matter and had nothing to do with the guest. She countered by saying that thanks to him, Lingen could join their group. The attendant ignored her statement and continued pouring tea for those present, looking straight ahead. Hun did not stop. She said that the northeastern army also divided and they could rule the whole country. The nun replied that she did not agree with the girl. She stood up and walked up to the guest. Holding out her hand to him, she said that she was ready to walk him to the gate. After that, he called Xiao with him and was about to leave the pavilion and leave the temple. Hun fell silent and watched what was happening, her eyes filling with anger. All those present in the gazebo headed towards the entrance gate. Hun furrowed her brows and was ready to do anything to stop what was happening. Then she loudly screamed after them that she wanted to sleep with the guest. The attendant didn't even turn around, not deigning to pay any attention to the girl in response to the screams. She continued to yell at Chinya that if she didn't want it, then Hun would do it herself. She intended to give birth to her first child. Then the nun turned around and looked at the girl with displeasure. She told her, pointing to her clothes, that she should study the rules again and come to the garden properly. She was dressed in her gang's uniform with a red-cropped sweatshirt and black tight pants, and everyone present took notice. She raised her hand with a displeased face and pointed her finger at the guy, declaring that she wanted to sleep with him. He was indignant and cast a contemptuous glance at her, without uttering a word. The girl then turned to the rest of her team and commanded them to follow her. They headed in the opposite direction to their homes, realizing that there was nothing more for them to do here. The servant turned to the man and said that she would guard him in the garden and fight for his freedom outside of it. He only had to choose whether to stay in the temple or leave and continue to wander. He sighed and agreed to stay, realizing that this option would be more comfortable and reliable. Then he sat down at the table again and asked for some more medlar. Cherry blossoms were blooming all around, and small birds were sitting on the branches and chirping, their singing creating a peaceful atmosphere. After some time, the guy had already changed into old clothes and was helping to improve the garden, dragging a heavy concrete sculpture. He was panting from the heat and fatigue, sweat was streaming down him, and his face was red from the strain. Xiaoye ran up to him, wearing a new short traditional dress with a red skirt, and asked the guy to evaluate her outfit. He called her to sit with him at the table in the gazebo. Sitting down on the stone seat, in the shape of a visa, which he was dragging, he informed her that the girl needed to change into old clothes, as there was a corresponding rule in this garden. He invited her to sit opposite him and arm wrestle. She was surprised by his proposal, and said that she does not do arm wrestling. The guy started to tease the girl and said that it would be fun, but she replied that she couldn't fight him. He told her to forget about such prejudices, no matter who told her so. Xiao firmly refused and told him that he couldn't defeat others, so he was trying to use her to make his presence more significant. He told her that he could catch a dragonfly for her if she agreed. She frowned and looked at him with displeasure, without answering. Then he finally persuaded her to participate, and they sat opposite each other, clasping their hands on the table. The guy asked her to use all her strength in this fight. He started the countdown before the start. Then, the boy screamed, marking the beginning of their fight. A moment later, he was able to easily place her hand on the table. Xiao screamed in pain and pulled her hand back. He asked if she really used all her strength. She confirmed this with irritation and continued to dodge his touch. He tried to take her hand to try again. Then he calmed down and asked her for forgiveness, and they sat down at the table again. At this moment, the servant Qin Ye approached them and greeted them, asking what they were playing. He looked up at her and, without answering, asked if she could wrestle with him. She replied that it was stupid, and she didn't want to play such games. While she was sitting down with them, he began to persuade her to try it anyway. She gave him her hand, they placed them on his elbows, then the nun asked him why he wanted to play this game so much. He answered her that he had many questions that he would like to find answers to. Xiaoye interjected, still rubbing her wrist, and said that he couldn't win against a woman, and it hurt his pride. He ignored her comment and asked Qinye to be more serious and fight him. She replied that every person has many questions, and smiled slightly. After the countdown, they began to fight. He looked straight into her eyes, trying to notice something in them. She looked back at him calmly and imperturbably, without expressing a drop of fear or doubt. The fight was intense, and after a while, their hands were still in the middle. Xiao watched this with interest. She did not understand why the servant even agreed to such an adventure. The guy looked at the nun's face as if he was trying to get important information for himself based on her gaze. Her face did not change and remained as serene as always. After a time of intense struggle, she still could not defeat him, and he dropped her hand on the table. She noted that men were much stronger than women. He looked at her, leaving it unanswered. Shinya then turned to him and asked if she had answered his questions. He remained silent and thoughtful. Then the guy exhaled and asked what kind of relationship the servant had with the red-haired girl Hong Ying. She replied that they had a business relationship. She was a good warrior, and Jiangnan Palace was good at business. The nun told him that one contributes to the struggle, and the other to the economy, and thanks to this, the palace lives in peace, to which the guy asked which of them obeys whom. She answered his question with a question and asked if he was afraid that Hong Ying would come for him. He was indignant at this question and asked it again ironically, hinting that he could not be afraid of a girl. The minister said they were talking about the devil. The guy felt someone approaching him from behind. He turned around abruptly and saw Hun behind him with red ponytails hanging down her sides. In shock, he jumped up from his chair with a scream and fell onto the table. She calmly told him that she just wanted to sleep with him, not eat him, so there was no need to be so afraid of her. The guy sat down on the table and began to look at her thoughtfully. The attendant said that Hun was a very beautiful young girl, and she didn't even understand what there was to dislike about her. He turned to the nun and asked why they thought this would make him happy. She was a little embarrassed and blushed at this question. He began to rise to his feet and said that even though the world had changed, it didn't mean it was all his fault. He turned to Hong Ying and asked if she really thought she could sleep with him any time now, just because reality had changed. The guy told her not to even dream about it because she wanted to treat him like a cat and play with him like a dog. He confidently stated that he would only do what he wanted, and he added that it would not be he who would sleep with her, but she who would sleep with him. While warming her hands, she asked what the difference was and if he was so arrogant, then they could fight and the winner would be the boss in bed. He looked at her with contempt and said nothing. The attendant covered her face with her hand, burning with shame. The guy shouted to the girl that he would sleep with whoever he wanted and she needed to come to terms with it because it couldn't be any other way. He then assumed a warrior pose, clenched his fists, and declared that he was going to catch a dragonfly. Hun looked after him with displeasure, but she understood that the power was on her side. The attendant noticed that he was the loudest man she had ever met. Night fell, and a full bright moon appeared in the sky, illuminating the roofs of Chinese houses. Meanwhile, someone was walking along the garden roads, holding an alcoholic drink in his hands. The girl ran after her and addressed her as the Red Sister. Trying with all her might to stop the one walking, she informed her that the master had given orders not to let anyone into his chambers that night. It was Hong Ying, pushing aside the girls who tried to stop her and telling them to go away. Having finished the last sip of her drink, she was already approaching her goal. She then brazenly threw the glass bottle near the front door of the man's bedroom and walked forward. She kicked the traditional Chinese doors, and they opened. The guy lying on the bed immediately turned towards the front door. A few meters away from him, in the passageway, stood Hun, wearing a long skirt and a red top. He began to get up from his bed, realizing that this would not end just like that. Fear appeared in his eyes. He did not understand how to act in such a situation and where to run. The guy told her not to even dare to approach him. She was already in high spirits and smeared red lipstick across her face in a fighting style, not intending to retreat. She walked deeper into his room and approached his bed without saying a word. He put his hand under the pillow, trying to feel something there. Then he took out a knife from there and, grabbing it, raised his hand with the cold weapon above himself, threatening the girl. She was not frightened by his pathetic attempts to defend himself, and with a light movement, she knocked the knife out of his hand, striking him in the face. He fell onto the bed, finding himself in a starting position, and blood began to flow from his nose. She started to climb on him and asked what was the matter. Would he really not let her even touch him? She hovered over him and declared that she would explore him from head to toe that evening. Then she crawled up to his neck and started biting. He screamed that it hurt. She began to kiss him on the cheek, which she had previously hit, and he tried to dodge. Then Hun began to twist his arms to stop him from resisting. He shouted at her to leave him alone immediately, but the girl didn't care. She began to kiss him, reaching his lips. Her red lipstick was imprinted on his face, and blood from his nose was smeared across his cheeks. In his position, he understood that he could not defend himself and decided to bite her ear. She screamed in pain and raised her hands to her ear. Blood began to flow from it. Then the girl swung her arm to hit him for causing such trouble. She slapped him on the other cheek with such force that abrasions immediately appeared on the spot. The girl had no intention of stopping and continued swinging her other hand, after which she gave him another slap on the other side. She continued until his head began to flop from side to side. Then she stopped and sat over him, looking at his face. He told her that she was sick. Then Hun tore his shirt and began to examine the man's torso. She grabbed his underpants and began to pull them out, after which she tore them up and threw them aside. She was in awe and looked at her victim as if he were a treasure. The girl understood that his body belonged entirely to her and was going to take advantage of this. She hung over him, slowly moving closer to his face. He got angry and, clenching his teeth, ordered her to get off him and go somewhere far away. Then he raised his head with force and hit her in the nose with his forehead. The girl also began to get angry. She stood up and began to rub her face, intending to take out all her aggression on him. She grabbed him by the torn parts of his shirt and pulled him towards her, asking what was wrong with him and why he was acting like this. Hong Ying assumed that she was not good enough for him, and in anger, she slammed her head into his face. She asked him who he thought he was and clenched her fist to punch. The girl hit him in the face with her fist. He was already covered in blood. She told him what he expected if he slept wherever he wanted and said that he should not be touched. She continued to hit him in the head and said that for them, he was just a concubine or a tool to achieve their goals. Hun was furious and couldn't stop. Blood was spraying from the guy's face. She called him an animal and told him to stop thinking of himself as a lord. She pointed him to his true place, saying that he was not an emperor or an important person. She then put her hand down his pants and accused him of not even being able to perform his manly duties. He was badly beaten and lay motionless while the girl tried to rape him, telling him that he was a useless piece of meat. By that time, his face was more like a bloody mess, and with his broken lips he could only send the girl back. Hong Ying's assistant, a member of her group, approached them and brought the medicine that they were going to give to the man. They opened a package of blue pills and began pouring them into his mangled mouth. The guy coughed and began to spit them out, bleeding at the same time. The girls did not retreat and continued to stand over the victim. A moment later, he could no longer contain himself and screamed at the top of his lungs like a wounded animal. Hun pressed even harder on his arm so that he couldn't move. She pinned him down with her legs, thereby fixing the man and completely subjugating him. The guy didn't even have the strength to resist after such a beating. He lay there while the rapist tried to carry out her plan. His face immediately swelled up, and huge bruises and bleeding wounds appeared everywhere. The assistant noticed that something was wrong with him. Tears appeared in the corners of his eyes, and blood appeared on his lips. Horrified, she continued to stare at the man, and suddenly, she understood. Blood flowed from his mouth, and he was shaking in pain. The girl screamed that he had bitten his tongue on purpose. Hong Ying's face was filled with horror. She didn't expect that he could do such a thing. The girls immediately began to stick their fingers in his mouth, trying to induce vomiting so that he would not choke or swallow blood. He began to cough, spitting out red clots onto the girls sitting nearby. Hong Ying was furious and kept asking what was going on with him and why he was torturing her. At that moment, the servant Chinya entered the room and shouted at the Red Sister to stop. She turned her head and gave her a displeased look. The nun reported that the Dongbei army had arrived in the neighboring city, then asked what she was even doing in this room. She answered her with irritation that she had almost finished her business. Chinya shouted at her, ordering her to get off him immediately. She commanded the girl that she must get to Taiju in 3 hours and arrange everything. The attendant added that she should inform Xiaoyan to retreat from Yancheng. Then she turned to her assistant Zhou Cheng and asked her to put Hun in order. Hong Ying did not stop and said that she would only leave this room when she finished her business there. For the first time, the nun was furious at her insolence and said that if she didn't get off the guy right away, their cooperation would end that very moment. The assistant looked at the servant in horror, who continued to say that there would be no supplies, no support, and they would have to leave Jianan Palace. Xinyi said there would be no more crossings across the Xinjiang River. The girl stopped and began to think, looking ahead, without turning to face the speaker. Then she closed her eyes and realized that she had to give in and comply with the demands. She began to get out of bed, leaving the body of the guy, who was already showing almost no signs of life. After which, Hong Ying went to the servant and asked her what was wrong with her and why she told her to stop what she had started. The nun looked at the Red Sister with disdain and did not say a word. The girl approached her and asked why she didn't want to keep the man as a talisman. Xinya wrinkled her brows and looked at her with an insulting expression, saying that he was a person who couldn't make such decisions for him. She walked past her and said that the guy couldn't even stand up anyway, so he should be left there. As she walked away, without turning around, she shouted to her victim that he would stay there. After some time, the guy sat over the pond and looked at his disfigured reflection. It was quiet around. There were many water lilies on the water, but he didn't care about that. He dangled his legs over the water and tried to come to his senses. The attendant and Xiao approached him and asked why he bit his tongue, trying to make sure he would not jump into the river. He ignored their question and, without raising his head, asked the nun if she had deliberately given in to him in arm wrestling. Xiaoye cried when she saw his face, and the attendant didn't answer him either. The guy said he thought the women's world was softer, but it seemed like the only difference between the sexes was strength. The girl sat down next to the guy, and the nun, turning to him, told him to pull himself together. He asked her what she was going to do with him. Chinya asked him if he didn't want to go to North Rice. The guy just mumbled, trying to speak through his swollen lips. He said he wanted to get out of the red and white face routine, assuming she had no intention of letting him go. Without turning her head towards him, she said that, on the contrary, she wanted him to leave as soon as possible. He turned his disfigured face towards her and did not quite understand the essence of what she was trying to say. The attendant added that he was not as useful as he thought and that by staying with them, he would only bring trouble to Jiangnan. He continued to look at her, although due to the swelling all over his face, he could hardly open his eyes. He turned to her and asked if they didn't need the last man on earth. Qinya replied briefly that he had understood her correctly. Xiao turned her surprised gaze towards her and continued listening to their conversation. He was offended to hear this, the guy's eyes filled with sadness. Then he came closer to her ear and wanted to tell her something, addressing her by name. But suddenly she jumped back and stood up abruptly, showing with all her gestures that she didn't like him. Attendant Qinya looked at him with a disappointed expression and said that he was not a man. She added that she does not remember a single person who would be so loud, hysterical, and eternally sad, asking for mercy at the slightest failure. The nun said that, even in this situation, the guy was wagging his tail like a pathetic dog, to which he became very indignant and turned to her in anger, asking her to repeat her statement. He told her that he was now in a world full of monsters and had nothing to lose, then asked if she really called this a small setback. Qinya turned away from him, saying that she thought she had met the last man, but it turned out that it was not so, listing the times where he screamed and cried. The attendant called him an ordinary pathetic child who still needed someone's protection. He remained silent to this. His eyes began to fill with tears again. Then he bowed his head over the water and quietly agreed with her. After that, he began to rise to his feet and said that without his power in this world, he was a nobody. The boy turned away from her and walked across the bridge in the opposite direction, adding that he had better return to the western river. She looked after him and declared that there was nothing in this man and that strength was not the main criterion for courage. He walked on without turning around, and she continued to talk to him about cruelty, perseverance, courage, confidence, and the goals that one must set for oneself. The nun said that willpower makes a real man out of a boy. He continued to walk away without responding to her words. Qinya shouted at him that he must understand that there would be no turning back, and he would not be able to return. She said that he could not escape his future, and the world as it was would never exist again. The woman continued to shout after him that the only thing he could count on was what could not be taken away from him, that is, his uniqueness and the traits that he cultivated in himself. She said that the main one is human will, and it will be his weapon. The guy didn't say a word while he was walking. She asked him if he was going to give up his will. Without turning around, the guy said that she was thinking about some kind of Superman, and not about an ordinary man. The servant did not agree with him, and replied that she was talking about an ordinary person. Wrinkling her brows, she added with displeasure, "When there is only one man left on the planet, then he is a Superman." After these words, he slowed his pace for a second. After walking several dozen meters across the bridge, he stopped without turning his head back. The nun then said that he asked her why women had changed so much, why he was the only man left on Earth, and why he had not met anyone for 3 years, but she had no answers to these questions. After which, she furiously shouted at him that everything was in his power. Qinya said that he needed to show himself as a man, to find answers not only for himself, but for them as well. The guy thought about her words and lowered his head. He just started answering her, saying that he didn't know what to do. But she interrupted him and told him to go north, and if that didn't give him clarity, then he needed to go to North America, and then to Europe, South America, Africa, until he found the answers. He only meekly asked if she really thought the North would be any different for him from this world. Then he turned on her, offended, and shouted that she still didn't understand anything. The attendant shouted at him, insisting that he had to find his own way. She added that in the North he would no longer have childish games, there would not be 3 or 6 wives and a peaceful world. There will be only uncertainty and fear, but he should not run from them, but, on the contrary, accept the fight with confidence. She continued, arguing that adventure and exploration of the unknown are in the very essence and nature of men. He understood that this was the only way to prove that he was a man to her and to those around him. The nun said that this was the only way he could regain his former strength and control his own freedom. Then the guy raised his swollen purple face from the beating to her and said a meaningful word. The attendant declared that in this garden he was not a man, he had no power there, and would never have freedom. After these words, he raised his knee and placed it on the edge of the bridge on which they were all standing. Then the guy stood completely on the edge and looked back at Qinya, about to carry out an unexpected idea. The outside of the bridge reflected the ripples of the water under the night sky. He took a step and flew straight into the water. Leaves floated in the water and reflected the traditional Chinese decorations of the houses and roofs hanging nearby. He entered the pond with a roar, splashes flying in all directions. Xiao screamed, worried that something might happen to the guy. The attendant's eyes widened, and she was also surprised by such a sudden decision. The girls jumped up and ran to the place where he had dived. A moment later, they were already at the edge of the bridge and looking at the water's surface. The pond was calm. There was no one on the surface. Then there was a bubbling sound under the water, indicating that the guy was about to appear. after which he swam up, sticking his head out and trying to catch his breath after holding it for such a long time. Xiao and the attendant stared at him in silent confusion as to his motivation. Wiping the streams of water running down his face with his hands, he said that the attendant was indeed right, and fear had indeed blinded him. He had forgotten how a man should think. A slight blush appeared on her cheeks. She smiled meekly and asked him to get out of the water quickly so as not to introduce an infection into the wounds. He plunged into the water once more, leaving only the top of his head sticking out above the surface. The nun took something out of her pocket and began to tell that the person she wanted to tell about was called Wang Shu. She had a photo of a girl in her hands. She explained that she was an Eastern biologist from MIT. After the disaster, she remotely supervised the rescue of 16 sperm banks, and now she is still trying to understand the reasons for such a disaster. She handed the photo to the guy and asked him to find her when he got to Beamy. The scientist would be able to help him. With wet hands, he took the photo and began to look at it, then decided to ask again about the sperm banks. He looked at the attendant and refused to comply with her request, as he felt that they wanted to use him as a donor. She explained to him that it was precisely because of the existence of such banks that he, as a man, was not needed. After that, he announced that he was going to run right then and there. Shinya said that she wanted to treat his wounds first, and the boy began to climb out of the water, climbing along the bridge. When he climbed out and sat on the edge, the nun said that tomorrow she would send someone who could accompany him to Yangshan port. While the woman was examining the wounds on his face, he looked at her face and with pity in his voice decided to ask her for a favor. He asked her to take care of Xiaoye, and she agreed. The guy frowned. He felt sorry to part with the girl, so he demanded that Chinya treat her like his own younger sister. Xiao looked pitiful, ready to cry, and asked to go with him. The guy bitterly replied that she could not go with him, to which she shouted that she was not going to split up. He wrung out his t-shirt and, without looking at the girls, replied that this time it definitely wouldn't work. Xiao objected to him, reminding him that he promised that he would never leave her. He replied that at that time he was blinded by other ideas and was too stupid. The boy raised his disfigured face to her and asked her to look at him. He said that he could not protect her. The girl exclaimed that only in him did she find a kindred spirit, and that in this regard they were very similar to each other. Then she added that they were a family, and he himself once told her this. The guy looked at her and couldn't find a word to answer. The nun was also silent. She understood that the two of them needed to stick together. The next day, the servant went out of the palace gates with the guests and assistants to see them off. She handed the departing people a small package and said that it was a snack for the road. Then she wanted to tell them their plan of action for the moment they reached Shanghai, but something interrupted her. In front of them, right at the gate of Jianan Palace, stood a group of girls with machine guns from the Hun team, blocking the way. Shinya, without thinking twice, responded brazenly to their impudence and ordered everyone to disperse. The girls began to answer her that they were just following Hong Ying's orders. The attendant had no intention of listening to their explanations and interrupted the speaker, demanding that she get out of the way. The girls on the team were scared and nervous because they had angered the manager. They were in a hopeless situation, realizing that they could not set up Hong Ying, but resisting the nun would also be fraught with consequences for them. However, they continued to stand their ground. Shinya was truly furious at the disobedience and decided to show her strength. She was about to strike with a running start. Throwing back the hem of her kimono, she ran up to the girl in the center who was talking to her and delivered a powerful kick to her stomach. The girl flew back several meters, straight towards the cars parked behind her. She crashed into the window of one of them and smashed it with a loud crash, glass shards flying in all directions. Then she returned to the guests and said that she would personally escort them out and at the same time see if anyone would dare to detain them. After that, the three of them headed towards her car, through the crowd of discouraged girls from Hong Ying's group, who were no longer able to interfere. Meanwhile, in the outskirts of the city of Linyi, dozens of vehicles from warring factions gathered in a huge field. On one side was a row of cars from the Hong Ying team, with special suspensions on the front to combat their rivals. On the other hand, the revved-up cars of Mina's group roared. Hun stood in the panoramic hatch of one of the cars and commanded her subordinate that it was time to start, who immediately transmitted a message to the other girls on the radio. The roar of skidding cars could be heard. The towing hooks of the cars had ropes attached to them. The cars were positioned so that the cable was taut, skirting nearby trees. There were trucks near the trees that provided tension. The cable passed directly in front of the line of cars on the Mina side. The first vehicles on their side moved forward like a wall towards their opponents and immediately encountered an obstacle in the form of a cable. Many of the girls driving did not see him, so they fell into a trap. For low cars, the cable passed almost above the driver's head, while high cars met it at the bumper. As a result, the force of the impact with the obstacle caused the cars to flip over in the air, and the girls flew out of the driver's seats, unable to control the vehicle. Hong Ying watched with cold blood as her plan was put into action, and her rivals suffered. There was silence on the side of the wrecked cars, and clouds of dust rose from the ground into the air. However, a moment later, a new line of cars appeared in the distance, approaching for a further attack. When the dust cleared, it became clear that there was a tank ahead. The tank was painted in bright pink camouflage, and Mina herself stood next to its gun. She gestured to the other drivers to stop and form a straight line with her. All the cars stopped at once, awaiting further instructions from the leader. Then Mina slyly asked Hong Ying if she had seen her hubby yet. The girls from her team were still in shock from such an extravagant appearance on the tank. Then Hun asked Mina if she really wanted to break the armistice agreement. Mina looked at her provocative outfit, different from the rest of the team, and concluded that she had definitely seen her man since she dressed like that. To this, Hong Ying only replied that if the girl was going to terminate the agreement, then they could decide it right there on the spot. Mina listened attentively to the speaker with a slight smile. She continued to talk about the consequences of breaking the treaty. In that case, Qingye would place Lingnan in the north, so Mina shouldn't even think about staying in Jiangnan for even a second longer. After these words, Mina headed forward in her tank, leaving the rest of the vehicles behind. Coming close to Hun and pointing the tank's gun directly at her car, she said that now she could only think about a man. Then she frowned and told her not to bother her with any showdowns, agreements, and where Linen would be. Hong Ying angrily replied that she had not seen any man. However, if the enemy decides to look for him in the Kangjiang Palace, the red-haired girl will destroy her. Looking her straight in the eye, she added that she would deal with anyone who even slightly resembled a man. The brunette remained silent, not taking her eyes off her. Then she laughed and called her a tyrant, saying that the girl was annoying her. After a whole day on the road, the guy with the servant Qinye and Xiao were in Shanghai. It was already evening, and lanterns and lights were lit everywhere in the windows of tall skyscrapers. They drove through the city, and on every street there were many beautiful and elegantly dressed girls. The swelling on the guy's face went down, and he simply looked out the window, observing the beauty of the metropolis. Large shopping centers had open verandas where groups of girls sat at tables. The guy realized that the situation in Shanghai was the same as in Beijing. The attendant drove the car silently. Xiaoya raised her head, looking out the window, and asked rhetorically if she could go home. Xinye replied that it was entirely possible. At that moment, the car was driving past a tall glass skyscraper with panoramic windows. Xiao looked lovingly at the city through the window, resting her head on her crossed arms. They passed houses with beautiful European-style architecture. Perhaps one of them was Xiao's house. The guy looked at the city with disappointment because he had hoped to see a different world from his previous experience. His attention was drawn to one street along which they were driving. Unlike the others, there were practically no streetlights on it and no lighting at all. In the semi-darkness, the light on one of them flickered dimly next to the coffee shop sign. Behind her, he noticed a dark alley from which the sounds of voices could be heard. The guy looked closely to understand what was going on there. He saw two girls dressed in dresses standing over a half-naked and exhausted man sitting on the ground. The guy saw masculine features and a beard in his face and realized that he was not alone. He was shocked by this realization and understood that he could not just leave it like that. He shouted at the driver to stop the car and, taken by surprise, it screeched to a halt. The guy started to spin from side to side, unable to find a place for himself. He asked the woman if she saw it, claiming that there was a man there. The girls sitting in the car were surprised and turned sharply towards the alley. The guy added that he saw two girls beating a man. However, the car had already passed the alley a little and nothing was visible. The attendant said they could not interfere, but he insisted that they needed to save him. He turned towards the alley and tried to see something else, asking the woman if she was not a member of the Jiangnan government and if this was not her city. She grabbed his hand as he tried to get out of the car. Xinye explained that she couldn't risk him because it might lead to his identity being exposed. The guy frowned and repeated to her once again that there was a man in the alley, hinting that it could be much more important. She disagreed with him and replied that there was no one there. He doubted her words and asked if she had seen it herself. The attendant said that there simply couldn't be a man there. The guy said that he couldn't agree with her and he simply had to check out the place and see everything with his own eyes. Then he opened the glove compartment and grabbed a pistol from there, just in case. He jumped out of the car and headed towards the target. Meanwhile, the girl in the dress could be heard accusing the man of not lasting even one night. The guy pointed the barrel of the gun at the girls and, calling out to them, ordered them to release the prisoner. One of them turned to the guy in admiration and noted that they now had another handsome man. The second one laughed and sarcastically noted that he was making too much noise here. He loaded his gun and, without answering, indicated that he was no longer going to joke with them. They froze and looked at him with curiosity. Both girls were dressed in satin Chinese evening dresses with flowers. Then a blinding light was directed at their faces and they winced, trying to see what was happening, holding out their hands. At that moment, the car pulled into an alley and turned on its high beams. The girl squinted, trying to make out the car. There was a red flashing light on its roof, and the number was hard to confuse with any other. They realized that the manager was behind the wheel and were extremely surprised and outraged by this circumstance. Without thinking twice, the girls decided that they should leave here quickly and headed around the corner, along the way expressing indignation at the spoiled fun. The guy stood in front of the headlights, trying to get a look at the victim. Xiao also got out of the car. He came closer to him and looked at him. The stranger's expression was either frightened or surprised. The guy paid attention to everything that characterizes a man. His gaze slid from the stubble on his face to the men's underwear he was wearing on the asphalt. He noticed his chest and hair growth. Something he saw gave rise to doubts in his head. He narrowed his eyes and came even closer. The stranger did not know what to expect and continued to remain silent with the same look. The guy reached his hand towards his face as if trying to remove something. Then he touched his mustache and realized that it was false and he had been mistaken. Having torn them away from his face, the guy was very upset and disappointed, having lost his last hope. He bent over him and, looking at the ground, sighed in despair and fatigue. The medallion given to him by the male gang still hung around his neck. The stranger noticed this and was surprised. He knew exactly what the symbol was and who it belonged to, and had some respect for the group. So, in horror, he only mumbled that he understood who was in front of him. At that very moment, a large black car crashed into the driver's car at high speed with a roar. She didn't see him and screamed from the blow. It hit right in the direction of her door. The window glass shattered all over the cabin. Smoke and dust began to rise around the cars from the impact. The airbag deployed inside the aggressor, and everything around was illuminated by the red flashing light on Chinya's roof. Then from behind the pillow, the driver showed her face. It was Mina. She said that it was very difficult for her to find what she had missed. The attendant saw her and called out to her, addressing her by name. Chinya began to climb out through the hole in her car window and asked the brunette to go away and leave this matter to her. The guy was horrified when he heard these words. For a second he thought that he could no longer trust anyone. Mina got out from behind the wheel of her car and told her partner to quickly go in pursuit. Xiao Ye quickly ran to the guy and said that they urgently needed to leave from there. He took her hand and they walked down the alley and around the corner. There was an abandoned bicycle nearby, and the guy immediately jumped on it, ordering the girl to follow his example and climb on. Mina's partner, wearing a windbreaker and with a ponytail, ran out from around the corner behind them. They were riding a bicycle a few meters away from her, quickly moving away. On their way, they encountered the verandas of all the establishments that he passed by in the car. The guy resourcefully pushed aside the umbrellas and chairs that were blocking the way. Flying tables and other objects from the veranda interfered with the girl pursuing them, getting tangled under her feet. The guy tried to drive with all his might, while Xiao watched what was happening to the girl behind his back. Having considerably overtaken her, they drove off the veranda while she made her way through the obstacles. Xiao was sitting in the basket on the handlebars of the bike the boy was riding, so they could monitor the situation from all sides. Suddenly, the girl reached into the guy's pocket and pulled out a gun. She took the safety off and intended to protect them. The guy was surprised, but didn't bother her. Xiao placed her elbows on his back and took aim at her pursuer. She narrowed her eyes, positioned the sight exactly on the course, and aimed the weapon. Mina's partner ran without slowing down. She noticed that she was now at a disadvantage. She was in Xiao Ye's sights, seeing the barrel of a gun in front of her. With trembling hands, the girl put her finger on the trigger and was ready to shoot, but suddenly the gun shook in her hands. She pulled the trigger and the bullet went in the wrong direction. The shot passed over the opponent's shoulder. After that, Xiao dropped the gun from her hands due to the strong recoil after the shot. She tried to reach it, but she couldn't. She started to fall, but the guy caught her, keeping her on the bike. Xiao was about to fall, but she managed to catch herself. By this time they were driving through a crowd of girls standing on the road. Xiao had an idea, and shouted to them that the secret agent Dong Beijun was here. All the girls turned around immediately. Xiao kept telling them that a secret agent was chasing them. They turned to face their pursuer, and she realized that she could no longer run through them. She paused, considering her next steps. Meanwhile, the guy and girl on the bicycle were already turning the corner and disappearing from her field of vision. She sighed in disappointment and decided that she would outsmart them. The girl turned around and decided to take a different route. She ran around the other side of the house to get around it. The pursuer ran parallel to the bicycle on another street and would eventually come face to face with them. The guy turned around and didn't notice anyone, not understanding where she was. He spun from side to side, continuing to drive along the house. They had only a little bit left before the turn. There was the last house left. The guy began to understand that the girl had changed tactics. He rode forward and looked at the corner, as if expecting her to appear. The girl was already running along the house to the intersection where the guy was heading. Then he began to run out of breath. It was difficult for him to lead two people, and he began to get tired. The pursuer was almost at the crossroads. The guy tried to squeeze out all the remaining strength from himself, breathing heavily and wrinkling his forehead from the tension. There were only a few seconds and meters left until the corner. Suddenly, a door opened, located just a couple of meters away from them, before reaching the corner, and a man stuck his head out from there. It was that same stranger from the alley with the fake stubble. He called them to come inside quickly. The guy got scared and cursed, not expecting to see him at that moment. Meanwhile, the girl pursuing them took on a new breath and ran towards the target at an accelerated pace. At great speed, the guy turned the steering wheel straight in the direction of the open door. A moment later, the couple were already on the threshold, riding and falling off their bikes, having missed the turn. The savior managed to slam the door behind them. At that very moment, the girl ran to the crossroads and began to look for her target with her eyes. However, the road was empty. She didn't see anyone on either side. After catching her breath, she noticed something above. Then she raised her head. Neon lights sparkled above the door that had just been slammed shut. There were huge banners with brutal men hanging on buildings everywhere. The place where the guy and the girl stopped was called the Steel Muscles Club.